Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we are here for my LCS Week 8 overview, analysis, and at the end, kind of a power rankings. I will be giving my power rankings, but obviously, it's going to be looking towards the future a bit more than maybe some of the other weeks, because it is the final week of the LCS regular season in spring here. Incredibly excited to go over the super week that we have here. Not only are we guaranteed at least 15 games across 3 days in this LCS super week, but because it's the final week of the season, there is definitely a possibility for us to get some tiebreaker games to add on to that as well. So it's going to be a long video. I hope you guys are strapped in. If you are ready for this one and if you are excited, let me know down in the comments section below. There is so much to talk about when it comes to the standings of the LCS, which teams are real, which teams aren't. I love to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback down in the comments section below. Of course, let me know how you guys feel about all of the teams. Your opinions are great, obviously. I'm glad when we can have those discussions down in the comments. Of course, at the end of the day, we all have our own opinions, and I'll definitely be sharing mine throughout this video. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into it. We're going to be covering all 15 at minimum games in this video, so pardon if I go a little bit quicker through some of the individual ones. I'll still get the main points across, but I'm going to try to keep each of these individual analyses down to about 5 minutes instead of the normal 6 or 7 that'll add up over the course of the video, and hopefully we're not here for 2.5 hours, but, you know, fingers crossed. I'm not always great at keeping things short, so we'll see. Let's go ahead and jump right into it, though, starting off with day number 1. And as per usual, we have FlyQuest kicking off our day in the LCS. I think this is like the 4th week in a row that they've been the first game of the week. And this one was a little bit interesting. Definitely some storylines to talk about. We had FlyQuest taking on Cloud9, the two best teams in the LCS going head-to-head. And Cloud9 comes out on top. FlyQuest looked untouchable for so many weeks leading into this season, but it really does seem that the wheels have fallen off a bit for FlyQuest in the last few weeks. A lot of the problems that, you know, we were hearing about them running into in scrims have definitely arisen on stage, and I'll definitely talk about why I think some of these things are happening, maybe some underperformances that are going on right now, but also why I think we need to pump the brakes on calling FlyQuest dead in the water. I think that the narrative has honestly gotten a little bit out of hand, and I'll talk about why I believe that later on in the video. But let's talk about Cloud9 first and foremost, because this team looks awesome right now. Ever since Eminus came into the mid lane, it feels like they've unlocked a completely new version of themselves. The amount of talent that is on this team is absolutely astounding now. Every single lane consistently wins 1v1 or 2v2 without even the help of Macro or the jungler, and that's pretty crazy because they might just have the best jungler in the LCS, obviously. Longtime followers of the channel know my feelings on Blabber. I'm pretty notoriously high on him as a player. I have been for years and years and years. I've gotten a lot of criticism for it, but these are the kinds of games that make me feel pretty vindicated and justified. I'm going to give my player of the game to Blabber. He was just everywhere he needed to be. He did a phenomenal job of tracking Spica in the early game. The Wukong and the Sedge matchup is pretty good for the Wukong early. Obviously, he's not going to be skirmishing super often with the Sedge, but he's going to be able to make a lot more plays, I would say, in the early game than Sedge, who needs to clear a bit faster. And I think Blabber definitely took advantage of that. You had a lot of push in the mid lane matchup. Orianna into Akali is going to be relatively Ori favored. Fudge was winning on the top side pretty hard, and then you've got a Draven down in the bot lane. And as we all know from this channel's history, any Draven game immediately becomes a Draven game. And honestly, this one maybe less so, but Cloud9 still did a really good job making sure Berserker got ahead. They put a ton of attention into Prince and into the bot lane just in general. And that's something that I was going to talk about with Fly a little bit later, but I think this is prudent to bring up now. That's really been kind of the secret sauce against FlyQuest over the course of these last few weeks. I talked about this a ton last week, but I'll reiterate it here for those of you who didn't watch the video. FlyQuest has definitely been on a downward spiral in the last few weeks. Not necessarily a big one. I mean, at the very worst, this team is 12-3, and so how bad could they really have been? But remember, they were undefeated for quite a bit of the season. They've actually dropped games in all 3 of the last few weeks, but for Prince in particular, he has been performing a little bit worse, and it definitely shows in the fact that I think other teams have realized that if they take Prince out of the equation, if they put a lot of their resources into stopping bot lane, if they attack his lane early and force somebody else on the team to win the game, it's just a lot more difficult for FlyQuest to win the game because they don't really have this superstar carry threat outside of Prince, and that's what Cloud9 did in this game. They attacked Berserker in the bot lane, they gave him a lot of resources on the Draven, and they made sure Prince was not able to play early on in the game. Now, obviously, that's going to be a little bit obvious from draft to just Draven into Zeri, but you were really hoping that some of the top side of FlyQuest could step up and pick up the pace a bit. That's just not what happened. Blabber did a great job neutralizing a lot of those threats. Eminence just straight up won in the mid lane matchup. Fudge just straight up won in the top lane matchup. Cloud9 basically did everything they needed to do in this game to solidify it. Everybody on the team was playing really well, and honestly, this is a first place level performance coming out from a team that I moved up into first place in my power rankings at the end of last week. As for FlyQuest, like I said, some concerns are starting to brew. Prince is a really, really, really good player. He is arguably the most talented player in the LCS, and I'm just worried about how much of an impact he's going to have for the rest of the year, because teams have found out that Prince is the reason they are winning games. The teams have found out that FlyQuest can't really operate as a top-tier team when Prince gets camped in the bot lane. Spica's not really taking over games in that way. Vikla's not really taking over games in that way. Vikla's going to get my dud of the game here. He was really bad on the Akali. Not only are you taking a counterpick matchup in draft, but you executed on it really poorly. If you were able to get that shuriken off in that first gank mid lane that Spica gave you, there's actually a chance that this game entirely turns around. Unfortunately, that goes wide, and, Vikla ends up with the dud of the game here, just not really having any sort of impact on the Akali. I do want to kind of nip the narrative in the bud a little bit here, because I've seen a lot of people online talking about Vikla in very, inflammatory terms, very much overreacting, as the internet tends to do. I've seen a lot of, is Vikla the worst import of the year, or does Vikla deserve to even be like a top 5 mid laner in the LCS? And obviously these are reactionary takes that just don't hold up to the film that we've seen over the course of the beginning of the year. I beg you to go watch a game from the first 5 weeks and just see how Vikla is absolutely torching kids. Yes, he's going through a little bit of a rough spell right now, but that happened last year for KT Rolster, and no one was complaining about that. And so I have faith that Vikla's going to be able to turn it around, but this wasn't a great performance. Spica kind of got out jungled, but there really wasn't a lot that he could do here. Impact kind of got run off the map by Fudge's Fiora, which is obviously a nice funny meme, but overall, I am just worried about FlyQuest, from a title contending perspective. This team is going to be fine in the short term. They're going to be able to win games, because if Prince does get ahead, they're going to be able to win. And the matchups where Spica and Vikla are just more talented, they're going to be able to win those even without Prince anyways, because they are good players. But when you go up against a team like Cloud9, when you're facing some of these other teams that are kind of top teams in the playoffs, you're really going to need that bot lane to step up. And if enemy teams are camping the shit out of that bot lane, you need the rest of the team to match that, and it just hasn't been like that over the past few weeks. I still have faith that they'll be able to do it, but definitely some question marks raised this week. As for Cloud9 on the other side, this team is awesome. They feel complete right now. I'm not saying that they are definitively, no matter what, the best team in the LCS, but they certainly are the best team right now. They proved that by beating the second best team in the league. Blabber looks great. Fudge is still an MVP candidate. Eminence has been the best mid laner in the region since he entered the LCS. And then Berserker and Sven are really finding their stride towards the back half of the season. Not that they were bad at any point, but it really does feel like they're taking over, especially now. Cloud9 is just one of those teams that took a little bit to kind of get to the stage where they became completely dominant, but trust me when I say they have absolutely hit it. Then moving on to our second game of day number 1, and this one was very intriguing. Two teams that definitely feel like they are fighting for their playoff lives. Obviously, not everyone's locked in moving into the final week. We had a matchup between Counter, Logic Gaming, and Golden Guardians, and CLG picking up a massive win here. Golden Guardians, another team that really hasn't been playing at the same level that maybe they were over the middle of the season towards the back half. They've been a little bit ice cold recently. Same thing for CLG, although that's just what CLG does. They'll have some weeks where they look unbeatable, and some weeks where they look like they couldn't beat me and my Clash team. Luckily, it feels like we're in a super week, which means that CLG is probably going to be doing just fine, and that's what they did in this game. They did more than just fine. They looked dominant. Bot lane in particular looked really good for this team. I really debated which member of the bot lane to give player of the game to, because I do think both of them generally deserved it here. You could give it to Luger, because he was the one doing all the damage and actively, I guess, pushing CLG forward, but he made a couple of mistakes, most notably somehow surviving blast coding himself into the middle of the entire Golden Guardians team. But I think even outside of that, I probably would have given it to the support here. I would have given it to Poom, who has honestly improved a lot over the course of this year. It was really, I liked Poom as a player last year, but the inconsistency that he brought to the table was just a little bit too much for me. There would be some games where he would look really good in that support role, but there would also be some games where he was significantly out of position. The Hylissang effect, as I like to call it. He would die getting vision, or he would just be pushed up really without any sort of purpose, just to try and posture aggressively, and he would be punished by good supports for it. It seems like he's limited a lot of those brain dead plays over the course of the year, the ones that just don't really have a lot of meaning, and it's just become a really consistent support. Now, he's not the best support in the region. He still has his flaws. He's not the best in the early 2v2, but he did a pretty damn good job in this game. I think the Xayah Rakan is going to be something that this team continuously goes back to. It clearly worked in this game, and I would expect them to be able to go back to that in the future. Obviously, CLG kind of goes with a more CLG-oriented comp, a scaling kind of safe bot lane that's going to be really consistent in both the early and the late game, because Luger is their consistent carry. And then a lot of crazy stuff around it. You've got the melee carry in the top lane for Dokla. That's something that they're very familiar with. It's been Aurelia a lot of the year, but this time they go for the Yone, and I kind of like this matchup into Sion. Generally, you should have a lot of pressure, but unfortunately, Dokla just played way too aggro in this game, died way too much. He was actually a candidate for dead of the game for me, but he ends up winning, so it's fine. Palafox looks really good on the Ori. Contract's definitely a great facilitator on the Sedge. Overall, it really was about this bot lane kind of carrying CLG forward, and that's a good sign for them overall. Then on the other side of the rift, you've got Golden Guardians. I don't know where to stand with this team, man. They looked so good over the middle of the season, but they've kind of come back down to earth, I would say, over the past few weeks. They've really just looked very mortal over the last few weeks, like just a generally good team. I'm still really high on Huhi as a player. I think he's actually been great, even over the stretch where this team has underperformed, in my opinion. I think Rivers had his moments, I think Gory's had his moments, but one of my big worries is Stixxay in the bot lane, who has really taken a step back, in my opinion. He's going to get my dud of the game here. He was quite bad in this game. Honestly, Xayah Rakan into Aphelios Thresh is a matchup that is hard, but it's playable. Like, it's not like you are just going to lose that no matter what. Stixxay should at least be able to try and get that game across, but unfortunately, he just had a pretty bad one in this one, and it's not the only one that he's had in recent weeks. Still think he's going to be fine, but like I said before, like I think I said last week, he's more of a product of his team than I think he is someone who's going to be pushing the team forward. He's looked awesome this year because he's been put in positions where he's allowed to play that super aggressive style when this team is losing, when Gory and River and Huhi are not generating the same kind of leads in the early game that maybe they had been over the middle of the season. I can see kind of the aggressiveness and the ability of this team drop significantly, and that's only going to get worse when they play against good teams that have an idea of what they want to do. And so that's kind of my big worry with Golden Guardians right now. River has certainly struggled over the last few games. Gory has certainly not been the guy that he was over the middle of the season over the past few games. And while Huhi is still probably the best player on the team, there's only so much that a Thresh can do here. So generally, I'm actually kind of out on the Golden Guardians. I've had them in my top 4. I've tried not to budge on that, even though I've been very hesitant after the end of last week in particular. I think this might be the week that they finally start falling down the power rankings. Obviously, they have plenty of time to fix this. They have 2 more games this week to kind of figure out what their problems are and get back on track, I guess. But I think the flaws of Golden Guardians are definitely starting to get exposed more than they were over the middle of the season. And then for CLG on the other side, this team is just kind of inconsistent, right? They can win almost any game, they can lose almost any game. They are the KT Rolster, the OMG, the whoever you want to call it of the LCS, right? That is who they are. There are going to be some weeks where they go 2-0, some weeks where they go 0-2, some weeks where they go 3-0. They're just hoping that this is one of the good weeks. Obviously, this team has the talent to be able to compete. We've seen that over the course of the last year. It's really just always going to be about consistency when it comes to CLG. And then moving on to our third game of day number 1 here, and this was a really intriguing matchup. Again, 2 teams that actually surprisingly have the same record going into this final week. A lot of these games are going to be incredibly important for how the playoffs shake out. This one definitely included. We had TSM taking on 100 Thieves, and 100 Thieves do pick up the win. They continue the win streak that they've been on as of recent. They really struggled over the middle part of the season. I think they went on like a 6 or 7 game loss streak right over the middle of the split. It was something absolutely abysmal, and it seems like they've course corrected. It seems like they've gotten on the right track, and a lot of that, in my opinion, has been Closer just getting more comfortable and getting back to playing his style of League of Legends. He was horrible over the middle part of the split. I would bet to wager he was a bottom 2, maybe bottom 3, like at best, jungler in the LCS over a majority of the spring split. Luckily, it seems that he has picked back up where he left off in 2022, at least over the last few weeks. He was awesome in this game on the Wukong. Pretty easy choice for player of the game. A lot of people are probably going to want to give this to Doublelift, but for me, Closer just had such a larger impact on the game as a whole that it felt pretty easy to give him and the Wukong the player of the game. Those setups towards the back half of the game were absolutely massive, and his team fighting prowess seems to have completely returned, if I'm being entirely honest. That was something he really did struggle with over the middle part of the split, and so it's good to see him feel a lot more comfortable going in team fights and not just being a secondary passenger to whatever Bjergsen and Busio ended up doing as engages. It really does feel nice to see Closer taking the initiative and playing aggressive again. But we do have to shout out the bot lane, because Doublelift and Busio played really well. They were the two that I felt the least bad about over the course of their, really bad stretch. I think Busio in particular had some bad games, but, I would say for the most part, Doublelift was fine, even in the stretches where this team was abysmally bad. It usually wasn't him that was, horribly losing lane. They were typically solid in lane. It was just kind of the map that was burning. They weren't winning, don't get me wrong, but they weren't losing, which I think was more than I could say for maybe the rest of this roster, but they were really good in this game. You get the Jinx Renata. This is obviously a bot lane that they have practiced quite a bit of. I talked about this last week, but Busio looks a lot better on these, off engagers. I don't really know how you say it, right? Like, these non-tanky engagers. Things like the Rakan obviously come to mind. That's his best champion, but Renata kind of fits into that as well. Can hook champions from afar, but that ultimate is always going to be useful for starting an engage if you need it, or following up on an engage, which could be even better, especially when you get that Scion to that Wukong, or even that Annie ultimate coming in. Maybe dropping that on a bunch of people. That could be a really effective way to fight here. I think Doublelift and Busio definitely played out the back half of this game really well. 100 Thieves definitely wasn't the cleanest game in the world. It wasn't the shortest game in the world. They definitely took their time trying to choke out TSM. Maple and Wild Turtle did a really good job keeping the game alive, but honestly, I don't really know how to say this. This felt like a very traditional 2016, 2017 TSM win with Bjergsen and Doublelift as a team that was kind of okay in the mid-game, in the early mid-game. They were fine, but eventually it just feels inevitable that those players are going to get online, that they're going to be useful in the late game, and that somehow they're going to keep up in gold. That was always the TSM experience, is we're down 5 kills, we're down 2 dragons, and the enemy is pressuring Baron, but somehow we're even in gold, right? 100 Thieves has a little bit of that this year, and I think that that's kind of the magic sauce that's going to allow them to win a lot more games than maybe expected. As for TSM on the other side, they are not the 2017 TSM. They are much more aggressive, which I honestly really like. This team actually won in the early game. It was super impressive. You might be looking at their comp and saying, if they won in the early game, how could they have possibly lost this? Because they had a fed Xayah, they had a really fed Aurelion Sol. How do you lose that game in the late game? And let me tell you, there were a couple players on this team that did not want to win. Solo being the chief participant, I would say, among that. Solo's actually been pretty good over the course of the split. He certainly hasn't been a negative for TSM. I think there have been a lot of negative top laners in the league this year. Solo's not been one of them. He's been pretty consistently fine over the course of the year. He really hasn't had a ton of standout moments, but that's okay, because he hasn't had a lot of bad moments either, and that's really what you're asking for. But this was probably his worst game of the spring split. I mean, some of those late game team fights on Cassante, he was just out of position, constantly running it, actively losing the game for his team. This was a bad showing from Solo. Chime had a particularly bad showing. I thought some of the engages that he came out with on the Rakan weren't very good, but he's been a lot better over the course of the season, so I'm willing to cut him a little bit of slack for one bad game. But Maple and Wild Turtle continue to look good. They are really, really stepping up this year. I'm not counting TSM out of the playoffs just yet. Obviously, it's going to be a pretty tough road for them to be able to get in here, but the way that their carry roles are playing right now, it is definitely still possible. Maple looked great on the Asol. Wild Turtle was team fighting really well on the Xayah. Unfortunately, just as a team effort, they weren't able to close it out. But TSM is not a team to be overlooked. They certainly are a competitor and a contender for a playoff spot, even if they do inevitably fall short, as TSM's expectations always do. And then for 100 Thieves on the other side, you're really hoping this team continues to keep it together. They have hit the 500 mark. If they can win out the rest of this week, they should guarantee themselves playoffs. And honestly, with the form that they're in, that's not entirely out of the realm of possibility. They have been white hot right after coming off of being ice cold. And honestly, that's a pretty good sign for this team's mentality and their confidence heading into probably the most important week of their season. Then moving on to our fourth game of day number 1, and this is where we start getting into Upset City. There are definitely some playoff spots that maybe aren't up for grabs, and teams may be coasting a tad bit. I think you know which team I'm talking about. We're going to be talking about Immortals versus Evil Geniuses in game number 4. And Immortals picks up a really big win here. Did not see this one coming. I thought EG was really going to start getting their shit together, especially towards the back half of the year. But maybe not so much. They did not look good in this game. We'll talk about that in a second. I do have to preface this game just a little bit. EG was not on stage. I know JoJo is sick. I don't know who else on the team is sick, but at the very least, enough of them are sick where they're not playing on the stage. They are playing from home right now. Don't really know how much that affected their performance, but, you know, we've seen people play sick, and we've seen them be just as good before. We've also seen some players take a nosedive when they're sick, so it's hard to really get a good grasp on what this Evil Geniuses team is, but figured I should preface that. That's going to be the case all week. I'll bring it up in their games very lightly from here on out, but this is kind of the big me explaining maybe why EG was playing kind of bad. But let's talk about Immortals. What a dominant win from an Immortals team that is really not winning a lot of games. I mean, I know that we are super into this team now that Balulu has been called up, and he feels really like the missing piece to kind of put everything together, but kind of a greedy draft coming in from EG. Yes, they banned out a lot of Balulu stuff. They banned out the Zoe. They banned out the Vel'Koz, but Balulu's not really the type of player that needs to be on his main carries in order to be a big influence. One of the big things that made Balulu so successful in the TCL for so many years, and especially at Worlds, when we talked about him, you know, in the Worlds coverage for many years, many years before, most of it was just him being a great facilitator for his teammates around him, and that's where the Galio pick comes in. That fits right into his repertoire of being this great, I don't know, supportive piece for the team. And banning out the Zoe, banning out the Vel'Koz, that means you're leaving up the Kindred. And that has not been up basically all year long for the Immortals. For Immortals. Kenvi goes ahead and takes that in this game. And this felt like NACL Kenvi again. He gets to play his best champion. That's always a good thing. He gets to look really good on it. Revenge gets to play Cassante, and he looks fantastic in the top lane. I am a big fan of Revenge. If you followed the channel this year in particular, you will know that. Tactical and Fleshy are looking a lot better. Fleshy's engages this game were actually really good on the Nautilus. That champion can sometimes look a little bit troll, especially when played by, you know, lower tier teams, but Fleshy looked awesome on the Nautilus engages this game. But I'd be remiss to not give player of the game to Balulu. Not only did he dominate his own laning phase against Jojo Pune, but he did a great job creating this big cone of terror, obviously, with Kenvi and Revenge in that same vein, like creating this zone where you just really had trouble team fighting them. You had trouble actually engaging on them at all. Tactical was doing a lot of damage. Kenvi was doing a lot of damage. Revenge was peeling off either the backline or diving their backline. Fleshy was engaging to create space. And Balulu was kind of doing a mix of all of it. This Immortals team felt very cohesive in this game, and that's just not something that I've been saying about this team all year long. Really impressive stuff coming out from IMT. I'm hoping that they're going to be able to keep up this level of gameplay for the rest of the split, because honestly, this team looked really good this week. As for Evil Geniuses on the other side, they looked the opposite. They looked the opposite of good. They looked bad. This was a miserable game from a team that has no business being this bad against a team in 9th place, especially when playoffs are coming up. I mean, this is not the time of the year to be getting a cold streak. Again, I get it. Maybe some of the, you know, sickness played into it, but Inspired looked awful. This was a miserable game from the Evil Geniuses jungler. I checked the Leaguepedia page for LCS. I think Inspired is leading all players in the LCS in player of the games. How? Like, I don't know how that's even possible. I track player of the game for my personal choices as well. He's not even the number 1 jungler. He's not even the number 2 jungler. I don't really know what the broadcast has been doing, giving Inspired so many players of the games, but, you know, if you looked at that page, you'd maybe think he's playing like an MVP. He is not playing like an MVP. I would consider 2023 so far a pretty big step back from what he was able to do in 2022. Now, that's not to say he's been garbage. I do think that this is easily his worst game of the split. But this Lee Sin game was really bad. I think JoJo played off of it really poorly. Balulu just kind of outplayed JoJo in the early game and he never found his footing again. Bot lane was a complete disaster. FBI had one of those games that just wasn't very good. Evil Geniuses is not the type of team that should be pulling out Lucian Nami in this current meta. Vulcan obviously getting hooked a lot by Fleshy, but FBI also getting hooked a lot by the Nautilus. And then Revenge just dominating this Scion up in the top lane. Not a good game for Evil Geniuses basically across the board. Not really a lot of positives for me to say about this team. I'm worried about them. I still think they should theoretically be fine, but you know, this is not the time of the year to go on a cold streak, and it's certainly not the time of the year to expose a lot of your flaws to the rest of the league. As for Immortals, though, it's a nice win. It doesn't really matter. This team is eliminated from playoffs, obviously, but at the very least, this is a nice confidence booster. Balulu coming into this team has really reinvigorated them. He's been really good as a player. I think Kenvi getting on something comfortable, Fleshy looking a lot better, maybe playing with the former teammate in Balulu. I think a lot of that is just going to be positive overall for Immortals. I'm not exactly sure what it means for the rest of this week, but ideally, this could be in a much more positive direction, especially when we're moving into summer. And then moving on to our final game of day number 1. And it's kind of an interesting one. Two teams that are on the edge of being eliminated from playoffs, or one team that's been eliminated, and one team that is desperately trying to keep their hopes alive. We had Dignitas taking on Team Liquid. And Liquid does pick up the win that they absolutely needed to stay alive in this race. This team has just not been very good over the course of the year. They've certainly been underperforming, but if there is a consolation prize, it's that they've been looking a lot better as of recent. I think they have had a second half of the season, kind of surge up to the top of the standings. There was a part of this year, through maybe like week 3 or 4, maybe even 5, where I was like, no shot TL is going to be anywhere close to the playoffs, but they are looking a lot better, and this is kind of an encapsulation of that. Dignitas, another team that at the very least has looked more competitive over the last few weeks. Maybe the wins haven't exactly come, although, more so than they got at the beginning part of the year, but at the very least, this team hasn't been rolling over in their grave like they did at the beginning of the year. All that goes out the window in this one. TL dominated. Dignitas played so passive, they just gave up everything on the map, and TL took it. They were happy to take it, but not a very good game from Dig. Let's talk about TL. My player of the game is going to go to Core. I was definitely debating who to give this to, but I think Core had the most obvious impact on the entire map. I think players like Harry were doing a great job of capitalizing on the impact that Core was creating, but at the end of the day, Core is this team's best player, and he has been this team's best player all year. I've been talking about it all season long. Team Liquid's strong lane has been their bot lane. I know that doesn't necessarily come through in the statistics. Yon's stats are relatively average for TL, but he's been by far their best team fighter. And then obviously their best statistical player, Summit, has completely thrown away multiple games for this team throughout the year, even though his stats look really good. So I would consider Core JJ their best player, and I think he showed that off in this one. A very easy choice for player of the game, but big ups to Harry. I've been very critical of Harry over the course of the season. He's just not been very good for Team Liquid, especially with a lot of this new blood mid lane talent coming in. Eminence for Cloud9, obviously having Balulu come in for Immortals. His stock, I think, is only lowered throughout the split. Luckily, he had a really good Akali game here. This was a champion he played a lot in Academy last year and the year before. Obviously, very practiced on it. I think, obviously, getting a lot of your plays set up by Core JJ is usually a pretty easy way in order to look good in games, but Harry still had to capitalize, and that's really not something that a lot of Team Liquid has done for most of the year. So at the very worst, props to Harry for that. Overall, I would say Team Liquid looked good in this game. They controlled the macro, they made aggressive calls and plays in the back half of the game. That Baron rush that they ended up getting absolutely for free because Dignitas just didn't want to check it. Again, I'll talk about Dig in a second, but TL looking good. They had to win this to keep their playoff hopes alive, and luckily for them, they did. As for Dignitas on the other side, just not a good showing. Again, this team has looked significantly more competitive in the last 2 weeks in particular than they had any time before that. Tomo coming in has obviously reignited a lot of the aggressive plays that this team wanted to play for, but this game, not so much. They really did just roll over and die. I think you could give dud of the game, honestly, to almost anybody on the enemy team. You could absolutely give it to Tomo. I'm going to give it to Jensen in the mid lane because he definitely had the least amount of aggression of anybody on the team. Santorin had a particularly bad game in the jungle. As Lee Sin, you need to try and make plays in the early game, but he kind of just let the game come to him, and that's just not really what you want to do. You want to pick like Lee Sin. If you're going to play that style, then you need to pick something a little bit more passive. Santorin obviously not necessarily looking great this season in general, but Jensen ends up getting it because the mid to late game was just so weak for Dignitas, and typically speaking, Jensen is the one that kind of runs that. In this game, he was by far the farthest behind. Even Tomo, who I thought had a pretty bad game, all things considered, was at the very least trying to make plays. It very much just felt like Jensen on this Talia, on this champion that really needs to shove, get out on the map and start affecting the macro part of the game. Especially into a matchup like Akali, you're just not going to be as strong as her in the late game. You really need to affect the map in that kind of way. He just didn't do that. He didn't even really try to do that. And so overall, Dignitas just looking very, very weak. I mean, this is a team that is 2-14 for a reason. They aren't particularly competitive. I don't really expect a lot of that to change in spring. I do think that they have some interesting players in organization already. I've talked at length about Dignitas Academy, or Dignitas Challengers, mind you, in my NACL coverage. Small plug for that. Of course, all of that's on my channel. Go find it. But if you're asking for results right now from this Dig team, you're just not going to get them. They are not very good in the iteration that they are in, even if they have looked better in recent weeks. As for Team Liquid, I'm not going to say that they are, a threat to be making playoffs, but you certainly can't take them lightly. Just because they are not, officially eliminated doesn't mean that they are a team that you can ignore. This is a team that has been winning recently against genuinely good teams. I think in a different universe, if the beginning of their season had started a lot differently, this is a team that absolutely should be making playoffs, probably one of the 6 best teams in the league right now. Unfortunately for them, and just for their chances as a whole, that hole they dug themselves in at the beginning of the year is maybe just a little bit too deep to crawl themselves out of. Now that we've wrapped up day number 1, it's time to move on to day number 2. Remember, it is a super week, so we got 3 full days and then maybe some tiebreakers at the end. So day 2 is right smack dab in the middle, and we kicked off day 2 with a pair of top teams in the league, especially, in terms of players on the team. A lot riding on this one. We had Evil Geniuses taking on 100 Thieves, and 100 Thieves continue their massive win streak by picking up a big win over EG in this one. They really feel to have solved a lot of their issues. A lot of the things that I personally was complaining about with this team, it really does feel like they have solved. I thought Closer and Bjerg were not playing well together as a duo. It felt like they had completely contradictory ways that they wanted to play the game. Bjerg wanted to scale into the late game. Closer wanted to be a lot more aggressive and active in the mid game. Tenacity was not playing particularly well on some carry-oriented picks at the beginning of the year. Doublelift and Bucio were fine. They were solid in lane, but they weren't, dominating the league, and certainly wasn't enough to carry the rest of the team who was struggling. But all of that seems to have gone out the window. 100 Thieves is playing a lot more cohesive as a team. They've really settled on an ideology, and honestly, it's working for them. You can say you like it, you can say you don't. But this team picking, mid-game, relatively scaling champions and just kind of waiting it out has really worked for them and has become a super viable strategy for them to win the game. They don't win in the early game. They haven't won in the early game basically any time on this win streak, but it doesn't really matter because they team fight so much better and their macro is so much better than the teams that they play against that they can capitalize on a lot of their mistakes. There's a reason I'm comparing this team a lot to 2016, 2017 TSM, and it's not just because of Bjergsen and Doublelift. The playstyle, I think, is very similar in that same vein as well. My player of the game here, kind of shockingly, is actually going to go to Tenacity up in the top lane. I know a lot of people are going to give it to Doublelift. I feel like some people are also going to give it to Bucio down in the support position. We'll talk about those two. Both of them had fantastic games, but Tenacity's ultimates this game were so ridiculously clutch. When you're talking about team fighting, when you're talking about making an impact towards the back half of the game, no one did that better in this game in particular than Tenacity on that Gragas. He really had, I don't want to say a rough start to his career. I honestly think that his struggles have been a little bit overblown by the community. He hasn't exactly been great, but I certainly don't think he's been, awful. We've seen rookies come in and do significantly worse than what Tenacity was doing, but he does seem to have gotten back on track in terms of being a cohesive positive for the team, and that definitely was the case in this game. Really good one from him. Doublelift and Bucio were also fantastic in the bottom lane. Xayah Rakan's going to be massive for this team. If I'm playing against 100 Thieves, I'm perma-banning the Rakan. I just don't want to play against it. It's not something that I really feel like I have to play against, and Bucio clearly shows a mastery of that champion that he doesn't have on other champions at this level yet. Of course, he's a really solid player, and he could definitely eventually get there, but his Rakan is so different to everything else he plays. It's definitely something I'm going to consider. And Doublelift, obviously, he's really good at Xayah. He's a little bit less bannable. He can basically play whatever you need him to, but really, really good game from Doublelift. He was the player of the game, I think, on the broadcast. And I totally understand why. 10-1-5 is a really good scoreline. And he did a ton of damage this game. Bjerg was good. Closer was good. Everybody in 100 Thieves kind of holding up their end of the bargain. Evil Geniuses, the complete opposite. Nobody's holding up their end of the bargain. This team has fallen off of a cliff. Second game in a row where they just look completely hopeless. They actually won in the early game. JoJo had a lot of gold on this Veigar, a champion that notoriously only scales great into the late game. How do you screw up being super far ahead on Veigar? You've got a gold lead on the Caitlyn Lux, because they're Caitlyn Lux, inspired on a champion that can, not only peel, but engage as well. You've got Someday on Cassante, and then it's just bad play after bad play after bad play. Dud of the game's gonna go to JoJo Pume. He has 6 dud of the games this year for me in the LCS. That's the second most of any player in the entire league, only behind Spawn, who got replaced. That shows you where JoJo has kind of been at for most of this split. Of course, he also has quite a few player of the games as well that kind of balance that out, but it's not really been a hugely positive split for JoJo as a player. I have faith in the talent. I have faith in the work effort, the work ethic that JoJo has behind the monitor, but this has been his worst split as a major pro, and I don't really know what else to say. He's got to turn it around. He cannot play like this and expect EG to be able to win a lot of games. Inspired has definitely fallen down. FBI and Vulcan didn't really know what to do with their lead. Vulcan in particular just didn't really have a lot of agency in the mid game. A lot of that was created by the fact that his team generally just didn't have pressure even though they were ahead. I'm not blaming him entirely for that, but the team in general just feels lost. They feel like they don't really have an idea of how to play the mid game. That's the exact opposite of what 100 Thieves is going through right now. This is kind of a problem that has plagued Evil Geniuses all year long. Luckily, they've been able to play their way out of it, but they're not really able to play their way out of it right now. They are struggling, and they need a fix fast. If they continue to play like this, they are going to be a first-round exit. As for 100 Thieves, they are not playing like a first-round exit right now. I believe that is win number 4 in a row for this team. That is super duper good. They have figured out how they want to play the game. Even if people don't like it, as long as it wins, that's all that matters. Tenacity is playing better. Closer is playing better. Busio and Doublelift are playing well. Bjergsen feels like he has agency. 100 Thieves is genuinely looking like a threat right now, and there's a real possibility that this could be a top 3 team, not only in my power rankings, but in the standings should a lot of things fall their way in the last day. Then we moved on to game number 2 in day number 2, and this one was definitely a little bit of a change of pace. Had two, I would say upper echelon teams going up against each other. Not so much the case in this second game here. We had TSM taking on Dignitas. TSM definitely still fighting for their playoff lives, and they get it. They get a chance here by picking up the win against Dig. Absolutely necessary again for them to even have a shot at being able to fight for their lives on the third and final day. But they do it. They go up against the worst team in the league, and they make it worth their while. One thing to note here, we do have a substitution coming in for TSM. Solo had a pretty bad day 1, I guess bad enough for them to pull him for this game and put in their Challengers top laner, Hanser. Obviously, TSM fans are familiar with Hanser from the many championships that he was able to win with them in the mid-2010s, but he's actually been killing it in Challengers so far this year. I think you can make a really solid case that he's genuinely just been the best top laner in the NACL over the course of this year. Certainly the most consistent, even on a team that hasn't been particularly good in TSM Challengers. And so I actually kind of like this decision, and Hanser comes in and proves me right basically immediately with getting player of the game. He pulls out the Scion, he builds full tank, and then he says, screw it, I don't care that I'm a full tank. I'm going to play like an assassin. I'm going to play like I built Lethality Scion, and he goes on a rampage in the mid to late game. A really fun game coming out from Hanser. If he's going to perform like this, leave him in. He is absolutely an upgrade to Solo, in my opinion, and I think that was shown off here. I think there's a real chance that Hanser is legitimately like a top 4, top 5 top laner in the league right now, like basically from moment 1, and I think that helps TSM a lot. Now, is it going to help them to playoffs? They've still got a pretty long way to go to get there, but this is a really good start. Again, Hanser looked really good. Maple was awesome in this game on the Taliyah. There are certain players that just play certain champions a little bit differently. Maple plays Taliyah so aggressive. That is definitely something he picked up from his time in the LMS and in the LPL, obviously, because you look at players like Xiaohu, Rookie, those are the players that I look at and, I watch them play Taliyah and I'm like, oh my god, they play her like she's the biggest damage carry in the entire world. Maple did something very similar this game. He was awesome, he was all over the map, but he was a true damage threat on the side of TSM. You might be looking at this team comp and wondering where exactly you're going to get like the carry damage from. Varus does a lot, first of all, but second off, Taliyah is more than enough if she's going to be piloted by a really good mid laner like this. So big credit to Maple, he was awesome. Boogie with some really good engages. Wild Turtle has been ridiculously consistent. Chime had a much better game in day number 2 than he did in day number 1 on this Soraka. TSM just looked like a really good team, and this is not the first time this year that they have done this. I think adding in the top lane to what this core has already been able to accomplish so far this year, they are a legitimate threat to make playoffs at 8 and 9. Obviously, some things would have to swing their way, but it's not impossible, and they definitely showed a lot here on day number 2. As for Dignitas on the other side, they're just not good. Again, any promise that this team was showing before this week feels like it has evaporated in the final week of the season. This team looked helpless in this game. Again, kind of got rolled by TSM. There really were no strengths. Jensen had moments in the game where he was dealing damage on one of his signature picks in Anivia, but outside of that, there was nothing. Santorin had a bad Vi game, got completely out-jungled, especially in the early game by Boogie, and you know what happens on Vi if you do not get that early lead. And then top lane was an absolute wasteland for this team. Armut's going to get dud of the game. He was completely destroyed by Hanser in a counter pick matchup. It's just not what you want to see. Armut has been one of the worst top laners in the region, if not the single worst top laner in 2023. Dignitas has had a myriad of problems, but top lane is definitely one that I would expect them to at least look at options for when it comes to summer. Armut probably not giving you a ridiculous amount of upside, and you do have a pretty good top laner in Hoon in the NACL right now. I don't know if he's going to be ready to take on an LCS role, especially for a team that doesn't necessarily have, like, major carry talent around him, but you know, I don't think Armut's the answer. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. Tomo has taken a major step back. Him and Ignar have had a really bad week up until this point. Again, Lucian Nami's quite a trap right now, and they fell into it. It's just not a lot of good for Dig. There really isn't a lot for me to say. This team got outplayed, and that's going to happen. They're just not talented enough to be able to keep up. They are a bottom 10 team in the league. As for TSM, this team genuinely can compete. I'm not entirely sure they are going to make playoffs just because of the way that the rest of the league ends up setting up, but this is not a bad team by any stretch of the imagination. In a lot of years, this would be a playoff team. Unfortunately, the cluster right around the middle of the standings right now is pretty thick. It's going to be interesting to see if they can make it through. Next, moving on to our third game of day number 2, and again, another game with immediate playoff implications. There really just aren't a lot of games left that don't matter really in any way for the playoffs, but this one very much does, as we can see a team eliminated right now. We saw Counter Logic Gaming take on Team Liquid, and CLG picks up the win, officially eliminating Team Liquid from playoff contention. With that 10th loss of the season, Team Liquid can no longer make playoffs at all, and you just gotta hang your head. There is really no excuse for this Team Liquid team. They spent a lot of money this offseason. They have a reigning world champion in the jungle, a former MVP in the top lane. You've got a former MVP and a former world champion in support. Two young guns, but two that have been, you know, they performed well before in their, you know, carry roles, and it just wasn't able to work out for them this split. But let's talk about CLG first and foremost, because they were the ones who ended up winning the game. Palafaker, baby, he's back. I'm super high on Palafox. I've always been super high on Palafox. Loved him in Academy, talked him up a lot, even back on like the Optic gaming days. If you know, people remember him back on Optic Academy, he was really good for that team. Ended up being brought over to Cloud9, where he really broke out, then was finally given a shot at the LCS level, I believe, with FlyQuest, and then obviously ending up here on CLG with a bunch of other members of the Island of Misfit Toys, the NA Academy farm. And he's been awesome. He was in my All-Pros last year for LCS. He wasn't really getting a lot of talk in that discussion, but I thought he was by far one of the more consistent mid laners in the entire region, and he's just gone and done it again in 2023. He was really good. NA Jace says who? NA Jace does not count when you're talking about Palafaker in the mid lane. He was awesome this game. The Jace was doing a ton of poke damage in the mid to late game, but even when he would full engage, I mean, he was blowing someone up in every single fight. A lot of times that was the Akali, sometimes that was the Wukong, sometimes that was the Zeri. Whoever he could get his hands on was just not going to be able to survive the engage. He was that strong in the mid game here, and he's making another really strong case to be at least considered for All-Pro as we move into the back part of the split. He's just going to do this every single split, isn't he? He's going to go really under the radar for 90% of the split, and then by the end, we're going to look at the grand scheme of what he's been able to accomplish and just go like, oh yeah, he was actually really good this split, and one of the most consistent mid laners in the entire region. They found a gem in getting Palafox here, and I'm really impressed with how he's been able to play. Obviously, he's not the only player on the team playing well. I love how Doko plays top lane matchups. Playing Gwen into a tank can sometimes be a lot of fun. It can sometimes be very boring if you don't get ahead early, but Doko did really well on the Gwen in this matchup into the Scion. He was just better than Summit. I mean, Summit did a decent job, you know, surviving in the early game, but once that Gwen had the opportunity to team fight, Dokla really took over. It was really the solo laners that created a lot of the pressure in this game for CLG, and that's a big positive, to see Luger and Poom be able to take a little bit more of a back seat. Contracts playing the Elise at a super high level, enabling Jace in the early game, and then also taking a little bit more of a supportive role as you just kind of let your solo laners take over the game. This is good synergy. This is good cohesion coming in from a CLG team that has consistently shown this over the course of the year. They are very strong, they are very fun to watch, and I have a feeling they are going to continue winning for quite a long time. Palafox looking good, Dokla looking good, the whole team really looking good. Loving CLG right now. As for TL on the other side, it's unfortunate that this is how your season ends. I do think this team was getting better over the back half of the split. Obviously, you're still going to play one more game, but no playoffs this split. There is a lot to consider. I don't know how much you can blame on the young rookies. I certainly don't think you can blame this split on Yeon. I've talked at length about how I don't think it's Yeon's fault, but Harry in the mid lane has certainly not been, I think, what you wanted coming into the year. I was lower on Harry than some other, academy analysts going into the year. I liked him as a player. I thought he was one of the better mid laners, if not the best mid laner in academy last year, but I wasn't super sure that he was going to be able to be slotted in to a really good team and immediately be one of the better mid laners in the region. Quite like I was sure of like a player like Yeon or a player like Busio or Tenacity or Ayla or any of the other, top players coming up from Academy. I didn't think Harry necessarily fit into that same category, and it does unfortunately appear that I've been proven right over the course of this split. This was another kind of poor game from him. He did a lot of damage on the Akali, and oftentimes he was trading, but he gave over so much gold to CLG and to Palafox in particular that it made the game so much harder for TL to even really play out towards the back half. I do think there were other options. Summit kind of got run over in the top lane. He didn't have a good game. Pioshik, Yeon, Core, none of them really stood out as having a particularly great game, but at the same time, none of them really gave over resources. I would just say, for TL, it was a coordinated effort to lose this split. That is how I think I would like to sum it up. There isn't one player that I can point to and say it's their fault, they're the weak link. If you replace them, you're going to be a lot better in summer. That's the worry, is I don't really know what that is. Summit had a bunch of bad games. Pioshik started off the split absolutely miserable, even if he got better as the year went on. Harry was just kind of a weak mid laner all along. Core was really good, and I think Yeon was more than serviceable, but that top side of the map certainly raises some question marks for Liquid, and I really have no idea what direction they're going to go in summer. That's going to be a big question mark for me, and they're definitely going to have some time to answer it because no playoffs for them. As for CLG on the other side, this all but locks them into playoffs. Obviously, some things would have to go really wrong for them in the following day for them to end up missing, but it's looking pretty good for the boys, and that's a really good thing to say. CLG is a really easy team to root for, basically all NA talent outside of Luger, but even Luger came through the system, right? And so CLG is really easy to root for. Palafox has been playing great. Contracts has looked good as of recent. Dokla's fun. Luger and Poom are awesome. It's just a great team to cheer for, and super weak CLG strikes again. And then moving on to our fourth game of day 2 here, and this is one of the few that definitely feels like it's a little bit disconnected from the playoff race. Both of these teams already at the very least locked remotely into their spots. One at the top and one at the bottom of the standings. We had Immortals taking on Cloud9, and C9 did pick up the win here, as they absolutely should have. But let's not forget, these two teams actually played, I think, right near the end of the first round robin, if not like the last game of the first round robin, because I remember them playing recently, maybe even with Eminence already in. Maybe I'm just completely wrong here, but this is just coming to mind. And I remember Fudge losing to Revenge in that top lane matchup. I remember Revenge genuinely having probably his best game of the split in that game. Unfortunately, they weren't able to pull out the win, but Fudge kind of got clapped in that one. Well, this was, pun entirely intended, a revenge game for Fudge. He pulls out the Jace. They flex the Cassante mid. That's insane. Love this from C9. Like, I really like this as an idea. And then they just play through top. They say, screw it. If Fudge is an MVP, like, did we all forget that Fudge was, like, the best player in the league? Maybe outside of Prince for the first, like, 3 weeks of the season? Like, it was Prince, it was Fudge. Like, those were the two players in the MVP conversation at the beginning of the year. And then, obviously, they just kind of fell off. Like, the conversation started to move in other directions. But, you know, Fudge is still that guy. He's still the best top laner in the league. And he proved it again on his NA Jace game. We just had 2 games back-to-back that were positive NA Jace games. Kind of wild to say that, but good for Fudge. Really happy to see him do this. I'm going to use this time to talk about the MVP discussion in a little bit of a grander scale. Obviously, I said last week that Prince was my frontrunner, and I don't disagree with that. I know that there are a lot of people out there who don't want to put Prince in that conversation, but I think especially with what's happening with FlyQuest recently, with that team kind of being exposed for not being able to play around anyone else, and for how dominant they were in the early game, or in the early part of the year, it just feels like Prince is definitely right up there for me. But if I had to throw another candidate into the top 2, it's probably Fudge, and that's probably my big 2 right now in terms of the MVP conversation. I think both of them have been awesome. Obviously, there are a bunch of really good players in the LCS. That's just my personal opinion. You know, obviously you guys might have a different one. I'm going to pull a little bit of a jat here and bring traditional sports into it. I know with the NBA MVP race going on right now, there's like crazy discourse. You're getting called every name in the book just for disagreeing that, you know, one player should win the MVP or the other player should win the MVP. All of these players, like Fudge, Prince, whoever, Blabber, whoever you want to put in that conversation, they're all MVP caliber players. And it's not really wrong to pick any of them. They're all having MVP level seasons. It's good for the league that we have so many players that can be included in a conversation like that, and Fudge is absolutely a part of that. Eminus looked great on the Cassante in the mid lane. Berserker and Sven are ridiculously consistent in the bot lane. Sven with the BM of the century throwing up the emote right after Immortals runs in and just ints the game away. Blabber continues to be awesome on these facilitators. What's really impressive about me to Blabber this year is that he really has taken a step back. I was worried about that fit with him and Eminus. I was worried that, you know, Blabber is someone who traditionally is going to want to generate resources for himself early, you know, kind of playing a little bit more for mid lane. That was a struggle that they went through last year when, you know, they didn't have Jensen in, when they were playing more for Fudge when he was in that role. It was definitely not suited to Blabber's strengths. It definitely feels like he's worked on being more of a facilitator, more of a supportive type of jungler, because he's been amazing at that. But he can also take resources when he needs to. It's just kind of moving those resources around the map. He's just gotten so good at it. Cloud9 is the best team in the LCS right now, and I don't really think that's that much up for debate after they beat FlyQuest. As for Immortals on the other side, it's not particularly shocking that this team kind of got bodied by Cloud9. You can look at the time and the score, and you can be like, maybe they held their own a bit. This was a slaughter. Any kills that were given on the side of Cloud9 were just, like, pity kills. I mean, they were just mercy kills, if you will. Kenvy's scoreline looks really good. He got completely out-jungled in this game. It certainly wasn't up to the standard that maybe the scoreline would tell you, but Immortals is just one of those teams, right? I actually think they'd be relatively competitive against a lot of the bottom teams in the league right now, but Cloud9's on a different level. They're just not going to be able to stand up to them. Revenge is going to get done of the game. Top lane was the focal point for Cloud9, and Immortals was just not ready to be able to handle that. Kenvy mostly in the mid lane trying to enable Balulu on his signature Zoe, and then, you know, this Jace just gets way too out of hand. You really have no way to actually deal with it. And there's really no way to punish the Cassante, like, actually. Like, there's no way you're going to be able to get on him and actually kill him in the mid lane with Viego and Zoe, and so it's just a really good strategy coming out from Cloud9, and they executed it well. Immortals is a bottom team. They've been out of the playoffs. I'm not really going to rag on them too much for being taken down by the #1 team, but Cloud9 looking good. It's definitely what we wanted to see in this game. Obviously, I hope they can continue this. That's really going to be the story surrounding Cloud9. It's just, can they keep this up? Are they going to run into any sort of turbulence? Because right now, at least up until this point in the season, ever since Eminus came in, basically everything's flowed freely, and that bodes pretty well for this team's playoff chances. And then moving on to our final game of day number 2 here, and it's a good one. We had FlyQuest taking on Golden Guardians, and FlyQuest does pick up the win. They really needed to get this one. Honestly, both teams really needed to pick up a win here. Unfortunately, only FlyQuest is going to be walking away with the dub right now. They've definitely needed this win. There's really no other way to put it. I don't want to say they were in free-fall mode. They had obviously already locked top 4 at the very worst, and so you didn't really have to worry too much about your position in terms of playoffs, but just for momentum, just for your mentality, for confidence sake, for believing in yourself's sake, you needed to be able to pick up this win, and they absolutely did. I thought they played really well in this game. Of course, some crazy macro moves, some mistakes here or there. My player of the game, though, was a pretty easy choice in this one. It is going to go to Vikla in the mid lane. He was really good on this Tristana. The amount of damage he was able to put out in a lot of these team fights was incredibly crucial towards FlyQuest actually winning the game. There is a large vocal section of the community that is super out on Vikla, and I, for the life of me, can't figure out why. Like, I get it. He had a bad game against Cloud9. Great, right? Like, he's been the best mid laner in the region this year. I honestly think that is true. I know that that's debatable, right? But, like, he's, like, top 3. Like, I don't really know how that's debatable. He has been winning matchups incredibly consistently. He has been able to make an impact in the late game. Yeah, maybe he's not Prince. Maybe he's not Spica, right? But, like, he's been really, really good for this team, and, you know, you go online, and that's not the impact that you're going to get. That's not the kind of, I guess, message that's being spread a lot by a lot of communities, and I personally disagree with that. I think I've really liked the tape that I've watched from him this year, specifically the beginning of the year I thought was really good, but this game in particular was also good. It feels like there's this big, I don't know, contingency of LCS fans that try to find one player to all, like, hive mind dislike at one time, no matter how they're actually playing the game. Vikla definitely feels like that one for this week. Obviously, it's been different players in the past. At times, it's been Blabber. You know, at times, it's been a lot of other people, to be entirely honest. But Vikla definitely feels like the hive mind's target, the Reddit hive mind's target right now. And maybe it's just me, but I personally don't see it. I think he's a really, really talented player who does make his team better, and I thought he played really well this game. Blaming him being able to survive in teamfights on BT is correct, but then at the same time, blame every AD carry for playing with Kraken Slayer and Gale Force, right? Like, if we're gonna go down that route, you know, you gotta be consistent with it. Items are there for a reason. If you're gonna use them, right? Like, you would be stupid not to buy BT on Tristana in this game, and so, I don't know. Whatever, man. Vico was really good. Impact was super good, especially towards the back half of the game. A little bit of a boring top lane trade early on in the game. K'Sante into Malphite's not really ever going to be this, like, dominant, you know, matchup for either side. Nobody's really going to be able to pull away in that one. But Impact was super crucial in the late game. Basically 1v5ing in the back of Baron Pit. He's taking basically 0 damage the entire fight, while GG is just taking the entirety of Baron's damage, and they end up having to back out. FlyQuest obviously comes in and ends up cleaning up, but without Impact being nearly as strong and tanky as he was, that fight becomes significantly harder. So Impact, Vikla, definitely the standouts. I thought Prince played about as well as he could into Malphite, Vi, LeBlanc, where he's just getting perma-dove 24/7. Like, he still did damage, kind of, into everyone that wasn't named Malphite, but you know, he got ulted like 6 times, and so he didn't really get to do a lot this game. It's good that Vikla and Impact were able to pick up the slack. I think it says more about Golden Guardians that they weren't able to win this than it says about FlyQuest. Generally, I think this was a pretty good game from them. As for Golden Guardians, yikes, man. Like, this team is destined to go 500. At the very best, this team is destined to go 500. They have never, ever finished above 500 in an LCS split as an organization, and they are dangerously close to keeping that up right now. They went into this week 9-6. They just had to win 1 game in the final week of the season, and they've lost their first 2. They've got 1 more chance tomorrow against a severely hampered Dignitas team. Hopefully they're going to be able to pick it up, but in this game, they just didn't look very good. River got heavy out-jungled in the early game, and what can I say? A Vi who gets out-jungled in the early game is incredibly useless. I say it way too often on this channel, but it just is the case. It's one of the takes that I think has aged better as the year has gone on. I had a lot of people arguing me with that on Twitter at the beginning of the year. Not so much anymore, man. That's just how Vi works. People like to think that this champion is just an all-seeing counter to, like, mobile ADCs. It's just not, right? Like, you're gonna get blown up. You don't really have the survivability, but Malphite into a Trist Varus comp, really like that. LeBlanc, I think, has some dive potential, and Gory played this game really well. Unfortunately, he just didn't have a lot of backup. River, like I said, is my dud of the game. The Vi really wasn't effective at all, even getting on the Tristana in the late game. She was just immediately blown up, and then 6A and Huhi, I just don't think we're really all that good. You're playing Lucian Nami. Come on, watch my videos. Don't play this champion. Overall, Golden Guardians is fine. They're a team that I'm really starting to get worried about in the grand scheme of things because, truthfully, like, they should make playoffs as long as things don't completely implode. In fact, I think they might be locked so long as TSM loses tomorrow, which is obviously not a guarantee, but they're playing FlyQuest, so they should lose. Even if they don't win a single game this week, they should be able to make playoffs. But if you don't win a single game this week, I mean, what does that mean for your playoff chances? This was a team that, at points in time, was looking actually dangerous for, like, a finals appearance, and now they look like a pretty easy bet for a first round out the way that they're currently playing. FlyQuest, on the other hand, they just got to get their shit together. If they can find a pattern, if they can get some confidence back, this team obviously has the talent to be the best team in the LCS. We saw that at the beginning of the year. It just feels like the mentality isn't quite as there. They've been figured out a bit more, but adaptation can come. This is a very smart organization led by some very smart people. I have faith that this team is going to be able to figure out at least a way to be relevant, and I think this game was a good sign that they were at least moving in the right direction. And now finally moving on to our third and technically final day here in the LCS in Week 8. Of course, probably not going to be the way that things end up in the regular season. We're probably going to have at least some tiebreakers with how the schedule has shaken out up until this point, but we won't know which ones they are until the end of the day. 4 of the 5 games on this day directly have playoff implications, so let's go ahead and get into them, starting with game number 1, and it's a matchup between Counter, Logic Gaming, and Cloud9, a must-win for CLG, and they get it done. A huge win for a CLG team that I don't think a lot of people gave a lot of chance in this game. That's a 3-0 Super Week coming out from CLG. Basically everything you could have asked for coming out from this team. They always perform well in the Super Weeks. That's pretty historical, not only for this roster, but for CLG as an org, just in general. Good to see that some traditions continue on basically no matter what. They just kind of dominated this game. They had a couple players who really stepped up and proved that they deserve to be near the upper echelon conversation of, the entire league right now with everything in turmoil. Player of the game, pretty easy choice. Gonna go to Contracts in the jungle. I've actually been pretty critical of Contracts over the course of the year. In my opinion, he's probably been the weakest member of CLG in 2023. That's not really saying a ridiculous amount, because I think, honestly, everybody on the team has definitely pulled their weight. I've always talked about them as more of a unit rather than individual pieces, and I absolutely still agree with that, but Contracts has had some games here or there where old Contracts gets a little bit reverted, and maybe some of the inting patterns can come back a bit. That was not the case at all here against his former team, his first team in the LCS in Cloud9, where he utterly dominated them. A really good showing from him on the Sejuani. This is a pick that he's generally just been really good at most of the year as well, but to see Contracts go into, 4 potential MVPs here, 3 really potential MVPs in Fudge, Blabber, Berserker, all these guys getting a bunch of hype and really just being the best player in the game is just a really impressive feat from a player like Contracts. Really, really happy to see him step up and really, really happy to see him play at a high level. It wasn't just him though, Palafaker's back. He had a really, really, really good week in the mid lane. Obviously, I've already talked at length in this video and in previous videos about Palafox. Really, really good player. The Talia in this game was strong. Mid lane was a huge hole for C9 in this game. We'll talk about that in a minute, but jungle mid, that was the turning point. That's what was so in favor of CLG in this game and what really made it a ton easier for them to be able to pick up a win. Luger and Poom were able to capitalize in the mid to late game really well. Luger, especially on that Zeri, got super fed in these team fights from everything that the Sedge and the Talia were setting up. Doklo was an unkillable tank on the Sion in the top lane. This was a huge win for a CLG team that finishes the regular season at 10-8. That locks them for playoffs. You just have to make top 6, and that puts them in the position where they have officially confirmed themselves for top 6. Depending on what happens in the next game as well, we might have confirmed everybody in the top 6, but CLG with a really nice win here. As for Cloud9 on the other side, definitely not what you wanted to see to end the season from the number 1 team, but this wasn't the most important game of the year for Cloud9. Even in their worst case scenario where FlyQuest does pick up a win later in the day, they still would get to play a tiebreaker at the very worst for first place. And obviously you probably would have liked to win this and not have to play the tiebreaker, just kind of secure first place on your own, but you're guaranteed at least the opportunity to play for that first place position, and so this loss here doesn't really affect your standings too much. It's maybe just a little bit unfortunate to see some of your players get a little bit exploited in this game, most notably the top side of the map and the jungle mid in general. Blabber, Eminus both had really bad games here, just kind of not being nearly as good as their counterparts in Contracts and Palafox on the other side, which is honestly kind of insane because this draft is something that they've gone back to a couple of times this year. The Jace flex between Fudge and Eminus has been a huge positive for Cloud9, I would say, and Blabber's Gragas is genuinely one of his best picks, that not to mention the fact that you've got Sven on Ashe, you've got Berserker and something that can deal damage both early and late, Fudge on a weak side tank that is like incredibly good at scaling and is really good into Sion. Like, this is a good draft for Cloud9 and they just couldn't execute on it. Some games you just don't have the same kind of firepower that you might have in some other ones, and unfortunately that was the case for C9. My dud of the game is going to go to Eminus in the mid lane. Some really aggressive plays coming out from Eminus. That's kind of his shtick. That's his whole MO. That's what he does. Unfortunately, in this game, it didn't necessarily work out in the same way that maybe it did when they were ahead. Eminus is one of those feast or famine players. He's going to look kind of bad in their losses just because he's never really going to stop trying to make plays. Now, for the most part, I would consider that a positive trait. Unfortunately, in this game, it just meant that Palafox and Contracts had a very easy target to continuously pick on, not only in a side lane, but in a team fight, in skirmishes. He was just a pretty easy target, I would say, overall for CLG. And I think he cost C9 a lot of gold this game, but Blabber was also really bad. Fudge was really bad. Berserker and Sven did not have the same kind of pressure that Luger and Poom had on the other side. Overall, I would say, generally speaking, C9 just wasn't on the same level in this game. Again, it's fine, but, you know, you put yourself in a situation where you might need to play a tiebreaker now, and I think Cloud9 would have just been much happier having won this game and moved on to first place, you know, without any sort of tie, but at the very least, you're going to get the chance to defend that first place spot, even if FlyQuest is able to tie you later in the day. But for CLG, this is massive. They needed this win really badly in order to secure their playoff spots. There was still some crazy shenanigans that could happen later on in the day. In order for CLG to be knocked out of playoffs, this confirms their spot in at 10-8. 10 wins is the magic number. If you hit that, you are in the playoffs, and CLG looked awesome this week. I'm hoping that they can keep up this level that they played over the course of the Super Week. Obviously, this team has been rather inconsistent over the course of the year, kind of flip-flopping back and forth, back and forth. This was a good week. That doesn't necessarily say good things about potential playoff week, but this team has a ton of chemistry. They work really well as a unit, and these players are very talented. This is a team that can absolutely upset somebody in the playoffs, and I certainly wouldn't put that past a team like CLG. And then moving on to our second game of day number 3 here, and this one maybe not the same kind of influence that game number 1 had. Game number 1 had a pretty big impact on this one, but we had TSM taking on FlyQuest. Of course, with CLG's win earlier, TSM had officially been eliminated from playoff contention. We had our top 6 locked, and that was only confirmed here now with FlyQuest being able to pick up the win in this game. Very much it was TSM not wanting to do Cloud9 any favors after they didn't do them any favors. I think the rivalry, of course, standing strong, but FlyQuest with a nice win here. Again, I really, really like this from them. This is a team that I think desperately needs to get their confidence back as quickly as possible, and if there ever was a confidence-building game, this was it. Yes, there were some mistakes. Yes, some of the players didn't necessarily play up to their potential, but I think for the most part, you're going to be walking out of this game as FlyQuest feeling pretty positive about how everything turned out. My player of the game is going to go to Prince. How could I not give it to the Pentakill King? He ended up finally getting his pentakill in their final game of the regular season. That might just seal him MVP votes. Obviously, I'm pretty pro Prince when it comes to the MVP discussion. I'm not sure if I'm going to put him first no matter what, but he at the very least is probably going to be in my top 2, top 3 for MVP votes. Obviously, he was just the best player in the league through the first 4 or 5 weeks of the season. You can talk about how recency bias might come into effect, and, you know, some voters might be a little fatigued with the fact that FlyQuest hasn't done as well lately, but I don't really agree with that. Like, again, this is a regular season award you got to take in every week into account, so Prince is definitely still up there for me, but he gets his pentakill. He definitely cements himself into that conversation, and he gets player of the game for me. The positioning in that final team fight was near perfect. He does such a great job at being able to handle aggro in a lot of these fights. I think that's really the difference between him and a lot of other AD carries in the region, and don't get me wrong, there are a lot of good ADCs in the region, but Prince's ability to take pressure and be able to distribute that and not, like, crumble under it, I think is really impressive stuff. There are very few AD carries, if any, I don't think there are any, in the LCS that get nearly as much pressure as Prince does in terms of enemy team, and I don't think anybody really holds up to that the same way that Prince does either, and so just impressive stuff. I do have to be a little bit critical of his bot lane partner in this one, in Ayla. I've been a little bit lower on Ayla since he entered the LCS. I loved him as a player. I thought he was going to be the player that translated the quickest into the LCS. In my opinion, he was by far the best player in the academy scene last year. I know a lot of people said it was Bucio. For me, it was Ayla. I thought they were very close, but Ayla was that guy for me. It just hasn't necessarily clicked, and I do kind of understand why. When you're looking at it from, like, a logical perspective, it does make sense that Ayla hasn't necessarily been able to dominate. He came in the middle of the season to a team that had already established the dynamic and attempted to insert himself. That's going to take a little bit of time to get used to. Obviously, I still think that he can join and, you know, raise the ceiling of this team. I think Ayla, from a mechanical standpoint, is just better than Winsome, but I do understand the idea that Winsome's communication and his synergy with Prince is probably better right now. It's really about what you want to do. Papa Smithy obviously came out in that interview with FlyQuest saying that the reason that they wanted to play Ayla was because it gave them a higher upside for international tournaments, and that I still probably agree with, even with Ayla maybe not playing as well right now. It's just something to consider. Viklo was really good. Spica was awesome in this game. Again, he just controls the jungle at a really high level. He maybe is the best jungler in the league. Obviously, him and Blabber are duking it out for that, and then Impact's just super solid on the top side. Overall, it was just a good game from FlyQuest. Really not a lot of complaints outside of some of the Heimerdinger plays that they had in the mid to late game. As for TSM on the other side, though, they didn't really show up today. After looking kind of okay the day before, Hanser coming in, really showing that he has some things left to prove. The team didn't really rebound and didn't really keep that momentum going into the final day. They had already been eliminated by the CLG win earlier on in the day, or in the game before this, but I would have hoped to see them put up at least a little bit more of a fight. It felt like a lot of these players played some of their worst games of the split. My dud of the game is going to go to Maple in the mid lane. This was definitely his worst game of the split. He's been awesome over the course of Spring Split so far. Genuinely one of the best mid laners in the entire region, but that did not show up even a little bit in this game. Some of those Syndra plays were just bad. It was missed positions. It was missing very easy stuns. Things that you typically wouldn't expect out of a player who was playing at the level that Maple was. I still think that he can be, an all-pro caliber player, right? He was an all-pro for most of this split, but definitely not the way you wanted to end it. Chime missed a ton of hooks on the Thresh. I think Thresh and Heimer is genuinely a shitty matchup that is just very hard to play out, but still, at the very least, you got to hit the hooks on the turrets. You got to at least show that you were aiming in the right direction. Chime just didn't have a very good one. Chime and Maple have probably been the two most consistent members of TSM. Obviously, Wild Turtle's been great ever since he came in, but before he came in, that bot lane position was kind of mess. So Maple, Chime, definitely probably the players that I was highest on for TSM. So to see them really disappoint and not have a very good game here is just kind of meh. I would say Wild Turtle was still good, made some mistakes. His over-aggressive positioning can sometimes bite this team in the butt when they're behind, and then Hanser's just kind of there. But overall, TSM is who they are, right? They are a competitive team, but unfortunately, it just wasn't enough to get them into the playoffs this split. I'm not exactly sure if they're going to be able to build on this to get to the playoffs in the next split in summer. Expanding the top 8 probably helps them a ton, but top 6 just seems to be a little bit out of reach for the talent level of this team. Either way, there are still a lot of fun players to watch on here, and they're certainly not a pushover. It's just kind of sad that their season had to end like this. As for FlyQuest on the other side, though, this team is good. Again, I know we're going to get lost in the sauce a bit when it comes to Fly, talking about how they've been underachieving and how they're probably going to disappoint in playoffs or whatever. Let's at the very least celebrate what they were able to accomplish as an organization in the regular season. Remember, this is not, the major top tier organization in NA. This is not, an org that has been permanently successful for many, many years. They have had an incredibly good regular season so far, and I think all of us are just kind of hoping that they're going to be able to translate that into something in the playoffs. Moving on to our third game of day number 3 here, and this was probably the game with the least amount of direct consequences in the final day. One team is locked for playoffs, the other team already eliminated. Not really much can change here, but it was interesting nonetheless. We had Team Liquid taking on Evil Geniuses, and Team Liquid picks up the win. Team Liquid eliminated, but as we all know, that's when they play their best League of Legends, when their season is already over. That is pretty consistent with their Worlds performances as well, so good to see the TL tradition being upheld this season, but man, for EG, there's some problems here. There's some worries at the very least. It feels like a lot of the things that they kind of banked on for a lot of their wins earlier on in the year are just not happening anymore. The consistency is just not there. That is all to say they still played pretty well in this game. You can see that from the scoreline. They were up in kills, they were up in pressure, they were up in gold for a lot of this game, but they just could not close it out. Really good endgame performance coming in from Team Liquid. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Starting off with my player of the game, which is going to go to Summit in the top lane. I've been very critical of Summit over the course of the year. His statistics are phenomenal. He leads top laners and pretty much everybody in the league in basically every actual isolated category. CSD at 15, GD at 15, that kind of stuff. Damage per minute. He's just dominant, and when it comes to obliterating top laners, he does a really good job in lane of being able to generate his own leads. The problem for Summit over the course of the year has been the ability to translate that into anything in the mid to late game. That has been a massive issue, not only for Summit, but for Team Liquid in general. And so to see them go behind early, it felt pretty over. This is a team that usually when they win, it's because they win early, but you're looking at a Fiora, you're looking at a Ryze, you're looking at a Jinx. This is a team that really does scale incredibly well into the late game, even with that Lee Sin. So you're kind of relying a bit on the fact that you can make it. You are going into a Felios, Cassante, Gragas, a really strong team fighting team, but you should be able to break through if you do survive long enough. And that's exactly what happened for TL. They actually played the endgame team fights here really, really solidly. most specifically two players in general, Summit definitely being one of them. The amount of pressure that he was able to create in a side lane for a majority of this game, just because really nobody on the side of Evil Geniuses had any chance of being able to stop him 1v1. But then also, people really underrate Fiora's ability as a champion to be able to team fight in the late game. She's really strong. I get that she's a great duelist and she's a great split pusher, and she really wants to be isolated in those 1v1 or 1v2 matchups, but she can, like, make 1v1s in the middle of team fights. It's not like she's going to be completely useless in a lot of those fights, and Summit honestly pressured incredibly well towards the back half of the game. In my opinion, without Summit's pressure, they probably don't end up winning this game, and so big ups to Summit in the top lane. Really, really good stuff from him. Just a consistently strong performance in the early game, in the mid game, and then in the late game as well. A complete performance coming out from the top laner. The other players that I want to shout out are going to be the bot lane. I've been really high on the TL bot lane basically all year. Obviously, I'm very, positive about Core JJ and what he's been able to bring to the team. I still think he's been the most consistent and probably the best player on this team throughout the year so far, but Yon honestly has been a little bit underrated in my opinion, in terms of the credit that he's getting versus how good he's actually been. The damage that this Jinx was doing in the back half of the game was so important. It's not just a given that a champion like Jinx is going to be able to outdamage an Aphelios in the late game, especially when Aphelios had so much gold on him. So for Yon to position so great towards the back half of the game, play so aggro, and really try and take over in the last few moments, it really is impressive stuff. Yon does have that killer instinct that a lot of AD carries in NA just don't have. It's really good to see. I do think that eventually he's going to be one of the best ADCs in the entire region. Do I think that's going to be in 2023? Probably not, but he's a really, really good player. He's obviously aided by a really good support. And him and Summit, in my opinion, Yon and Summit in that case, I think were the two best players on Team Liquid that kind of drove them forward into this win. They were also going to have the dud of the series, unfortunately, on their team. That's going to go to Pioshik. You're playing the Lee Sin. You want to try and be able to generate that early lead, especially into something like the Gragas, who's just going to outscale you. But Pioshik, for his part, had a pretty bad game on the Lee. He really didn't accomplish all that much in the early game. He kind of just let his team down, and they were at a gold deficit mostly because of the way he was playing. Pioshik, again, one of those players that's just been wildly inconsistent over the course of the year, and you cannot say that you're surprised. Like, I'm certainly not surprised. This is what Pioshik was in the LCK. He was a hyper inconsistent, occasionally really good jungler, and that's just what he's brought to North America. I'm not particularly surprised by what he's turned into, but luckily for TL, at least in this one, Summit, Yon, Core, able to pick up the slack and have a really good game for TL. As for Evil Geniuses on the other side, 0-3 Super Week. That's about as disastrous as it could possibly have gone. There were some positives to take away from this. I actually think, mechanically speaking, a lot of the Evil Geniuses players did well, especially in their laning phases. FBI and Vulcan were able to generate a nice lead into Yon and Core. Someday did a good job surviving the early laning phase against Summit, which is typically a little bit problematic. And Inspired, I thought, did a good job generating a lead for Evil Geniuses. The problem was the same problem that they've been having for months, even when they were winning, which is they don't really know how to turn a lead into a win. Usually speaking, they have waited for the other team, the enemy team, to make some massive mistakes so that they can capitalize, get everything on the map, and then just force the end with JoJo, Inspired, FBI, team fighting really well. That's not going to work now that teams are getting a lot more cohesive, and that's clearly being shown off here. They have no mid-game macro. They have no late-game idea of how to play, out these advantages, and I'm worried about Evil Geniuses. This is the kind of showing, and this is the kind of week in general that worries me in terms of their performance in the playoffs. This could very well be a first-round exit kind of team, and talent-wise, they are just way too talented for that. Again, I know that they were sick this weekend. I know they weren't playing on stage, and that might excuse some of the performances that they gave, but it certainly doesn't excuse all of them. And this Evil Geniuses team really, really is going to need to step up if they want to be anything more than an early exit from spring playoffs. And then TL on the other side, of course, their season is over as well. No playoffs for them, but 8-10 certainly could have been worse after the start to the year they had. They actually ended off the season on a pretty big high note. Not just this win, but I think in general the last few weeks have been pretty good for TL. There's a lot to build on going into Summer Split. Not exactly sure what this team is going to look like. It might look exactly the same. There might be changes. I don't really know what this team is going to do, but either way, I think you found your core to the team with Core and Yon. Those two players, I think, definitely are driving them forward, and Summit can win any game if you give him time. It's just going to be interesting to see what kind of decisions this team wants to make surrounding their roster going into next split. Moving on to our fourth game of day 3 here, and again, every single game from this point onwards matters for playoff seeding, including this one. We had Dignitas taking on Golden Guardians, and Dignitas picks up the win somehow, some way here. Golden Guardians finds a way to fumble the bag in the back half of the split, and they drop all 3 games in the Super Week. You know, that happened to EG as well. But remember, EG had a better record. They had already locked themselves for playoffs before this week. They were, at worst, probably going to get like top 4, top 5, somewhere in that realm. But Golden Guardians somehow have finished the year 9-9. It is almost completely improbable that we have gotten here. They started the year 0-4. And you were like, oh, this team's not a playoff team. They're bottom 3. You know, they're not looking all that good. And then they go on this massive, like, 8-0 run in the middle of the season to get to 8-4, I should say. And you're like, wow, maybe they're, like, one of the top 2 teams in the entire league? And then they've gone 1-5 in their last 6 games. It's, what is going on? This team is so ridiculously streaky, but I hate to say it, but I kind of called it a bit. It feels like they've crashed a bit back down to earth. They had a really killer run in the middle of the season when a lot of those other teams, like Evil Geniuses, like 100 Thieves, like Cloud9, weren't exactly playing their best League of Legends, but all of them seem to be in much better form now, and unfortunately, that's just not really been the same kind of adjustment that Golden Guardians has made. Let's go ahead and talk about Dignitas, though, because they were the ones who went out and won the freaking game, so let's talk about what Dig did right. Player of the game for me is going to go to Armut in the top lane. I've been very, very, very critical of Armut, not only this year, but last year as well on Mad Lions. So it's good to see him play Cassante and genuinely be really good here. That Cassante in teamfights can be so ridiculously difficult to actually deal with. And that's exemplified when we get down to these big, like, condensed fights all centered around a Kindred ult. That kind of happened in this game, especially when it became just the NA RAM for the last, like, 15-20 minutes of the game. You can talk about how NA macro has improved. You can talk about how we're kind of LCK clones in terms of how we've tried to play the game over the past decade, but this game was not that. This game was an LPL, you know, it's 20 minutes, 5-man mid, over and over and over until one team eventually breaks through. And that team was Dignitas, because you're looking at the Cassante and he's relatively unbreakable. The Vigar is absolutely huge for catching out small squishy targets, like the Jinx, like the Syndra, like the Kindred, when they want to play a little bit too aggressive. And then obviously Zeri in the back half of these team fights is going to be big. Santorin also played really, really well this game. I know a lot of people are going to want to give player of the game to him, but for me, it was Armut and the impact that he was able to make in a lot of these fights that ended up swinging the tide mostly in favor of Dig. I think overall, obviously, they're going to be pretty proud of this win. This is a team that, you know, really fought back from some horrible play at the beginning of the year. They got their new AD carry in. They got their support back with the Visa, and they really started locking in. I don't necessarily feel confident about this Dignitas team moving into next split, but at the very least, I feel more confident than maybe I did at the end of, like, week 4 this split. They have shown that they are at least able to compete in a lot of these games and even win some against some genuinely good teams. Now, do I think they're going to be able to do that consistently enough to make top 8? I really don't know. That's a major question mark for me, but there's plenty of questions to be answered, and none of them are going to be answered right now. It was a horrendous spring in terms of expectations and actual result, but at the very least, you're looking better in the final weeks than you were in the beginning of it. As for Golden Guardians on the other side, this is absolutely not how you wanted to end your regular season. This is a team that at one point in time was maybe looking at like a top 2, top 3 seed. You have not only fallen to lower bracket at the very least, but you have done so in a way that gives me almost no confidence that this team is going to be able to turn this around when we get to playoffs. Again, this is a team that has been incredibly streaky. They've had moments where they've looked good, but like I said, when River and Gory don't perform, this team really struggles to win. And unfortunately, that's what happened in this game. River's going to get my dud of the game on the Kindred. He just didn't look super comfortable on the pick. Obviously, I know he's been able to play it at a relatively decent level before, but maybe stay away from the Kindred moving forward into the future. I think that that's really one of those things that you should only really play if it's a champion that you have a ton of practice on at a pro level, because outside of that, it is very exploitable, and the ultimate can honestly screw your team over a bit more than you give it credit for, and that's kind of what happened multiple times this game. Kindred ult was honestly a net negative for Golden Guardians, and I think we saw that towards the back half of the game. Of course, Gory wasn't very good on the Syndra either, and as we know, there's really not anybody else in this team that's going to be able to rise above the jungle and mid lane are underperforming. If those two aren't able to generate leads, if Golden Guardians goes into the mid to late game at a deficit, they don't really do all that well playing from behind, and I think that was shown off here. I do think Licorice was playing a lot better towards the back half of the split. I still think he might be one of the worst top laners in the entire league, but at the very least, he was competitive in this game, and I think overall for GG, you're just kind of hoping and praying that something turns around once you get into playoffs, that you can get your confidence back a little bit, that River and Gory in particular can step up and become one of the better jungle mid duos in the league again, because if they play like this, if they play like they did in Week 8 in the playoffs, this team is going to be a very, very quick first round out. As for Dignitas on the other side, obviously, like I said, their season is over. Some things to think about, but at the very least, Armut looking good. At the very least, you didn't end off the week with 0 wins. Those are the positives that I think you can take away, even though, for the most part, when you're looking back at Spring Split 2023, you're really just going to see a massive disaster. And then moving on to our 5th game of Day 3, what is essentially supposed to be the final game of the LCS regular season in spring. It's not going to be that because of the tiebreaker situations that we already have available to us, but it is worth noting that, this was supposed to be the final game of the year. We had Immortals taking on 100 Thieves, and 100 Thieves pick up the win. They go 10-8, and they create what is probably the most interesting scenario that we could possibly have for tiebreakers. First of all, let's just talk about 100 Thieves before we jump into kind of the grand scheme of what this means for, the standings and the league as a whole. 100 Thieves just won like 6 games in a row to end the year. Big props to this team because they've looked so good over the past couple of weeks. They have looked like they have completely reinvented how they want to approach the game. And they feel so cohesive as a unit now, which is just the exact opposite of what I was saying, even when they were winning earlier on in the year. It is so good to see a team that has developed so much over the course of the season, having players like Closer and Tenacity and Bjergsen really struggle, even if players like Doublelift really started out hot. And then going through a big losing streak, kind of losing their way, not really understanding how they wanted to play, especially the early game, like really not having any idea about how to navigate that, always finding themselves in deficits, and then getting to a point where they just kind of capitalize on that, really feel out their style, and bring it to the next level, becoming one of the most devastating late game teams in the entire league, if not the most, over the course of the last few weeks. It's incredibly impressive what they do with absorbing pressure, what they do with being able to reignite a lot of that pressure elsewhere on the map, spread the wealth, etc. It's just really good stuff coming in from 100 Thieves. It's very clinical, and it's very good League of Legends, and so big ups to them. My player of the game here, I think there are a lot of candidates for this. Basically everybody on 100 Thieves had a super game in this one against Immortals. This was a little bit of a blowout, if only in the sense that Immortals absolutely tried to make a lot of plays, and they just were never able to get their foot in the ground. But my player of the game is going to go to Bjergsen on this Annie. I know a lot of people are going to give it to Doublelift on the Jinx because he was given a ton of pressure by Immortals. I mean, they spent the entire game just hoping and praying that they could kill him, and they did a couple times, but outside of that, they basically accomplished nothing, and Doublelift was still ridiculously relevant. I think a lot of people are going to want to give it to Closer because of those engages. The Wukong damage was really out of this world in this game, but I'm going to give it to Bjergsen, not only because the Annie damage was absolutely crazy, not only because he was in every single spot that he needed to be in. He had basically perfect macro throughout this game, but it was so funny watching that final team fight because they spend so much trying to kill Doublelift, and they do eventually kill Doublelift, only for Bjergsen to have Tibbers and just essentially have another AD carry with the amount of damage that Tibbers was putting out. Absolutely ludicrous stuff. This was a super fun game to watch on the side of 100T. And to me, you could really give any of them player of the game. I gave it to Bjerg just because I think the Annie was probably the most impactful champion towards the back half, but Closer played awesome, Doublelift played awesome, Busio had some fantastic hooks. Tenacity has really unlocked the best version of him as this like weak side tank player, which is crazy to say. I did not think that was going to be the version of Tenacity that ended up making it look a lot better in the LCS, but overall, 100 Thieves has really found a lot of their niches, and I think they've capitalized on them super well this year so far. As for Immortals on the other side, an unfortunate way to end your split. 4 wins is still okay. It's certainly not disastrous. This team really didn't have a lot of expectations going into the year. I know myself and a lot of other analysts put them as the number 10 team in the league going into the season. So 4 wins really isn't as bad as it could have been. However, not exactly the game that you wanted to end on. My dud of the game is going to go to Kenvi. They spent so many resources diving the backline. They spent Vi ultimate every time. Rakan was diving in. Ahri was diving in. And yet they just never really were able to make anything out of it. A lot of that was just the fact that Vi got out jungled early on in the game. And what do we all know? When Vi gets out jungled, even when she goes in, she is completely useless because she gets instantly blown up without gold. And that's what happened for Kenvi this game. Just not really a lot of, good plays to be made coming out from the Immortals jungler. But I don't really want to sit here and harp on the bad for Immortals because their season is over. So let's kind of talk about the grand scheme of things for Immortals. I think some of these players definitely showed some promise. Revenge, Balulu, the 2 players that come to mind as players that I would definitely keep running with if I was Immortals. Everybody else is definitely up for debate. Kenvi and Tactical both had really solid moments this year, and I think both of them looked, good at points, but they also at points looked really, really bad. Kenvi's small champion pool was definitely highlighted. The Graves and Kindred basically banned out every single game against Immortals, and Kenvi not really being able to adapt to any sort of different kind of meta was definitely concerning, but Tactical in that same vein, just playing way too aggressive at points, getting his team into trouble, dying way too often as the AD carry. It's just not a good look, but, on the flip side, there were a lot of games where Kenvi did get those champions and really popped off, looked like one of the best junglers in the league, when he got his main champions. And then Tactical had games where he solo carried Immortals with the damage that he was able to put out from the aggressive plays, and so definitely some decisions to make for this organization. I'm not exactly sure what direction they might want to go in, but I do kind of like how this team played, especially towards the back half of the year. I would keep around Revenge and Balulu for sure, and probably Fleshy. Fleshy got a lot better once Balulu came in. I think the communication started to flow a little bit easier for him. The other 2, I'm not entirely sold on. You could make an argument one way or the other for both of them, and I would totally understand. Whatever Immortals ends up doing, I still think that it's probably going to be a development year for them, basically no matter what, and, they weren't really expecting to win a lot of games, so the 4-win season, finishing in 9th place, it absolutely could have been worse for Immortals. And then for 100 Thieves, they've created what is probably the most interesting scenario that we possibly could have gotten, and that is 3 tiebreaker games. Obviously, we have C9 and FlyQuest at the top of the standings, but 100 Thieves has made it a 3-way tie for 3rd place right now, so we're going to be getting a bunch of tiebreaker games in this video. We're going to be talking about, obviously, C9 FlyQuest first, but, I'm really excited to see if 100 Thieves can continue this momentum, continue this winning streak, and somehow, some way, after the middle of the season they had, finish off the season in the top 3. And that is going to mean we can now jump into our tiebreakers. We have a couple of tiebreakers to go over, 3 in particular. So I'll kind of set up the circumstances here for you now. The first game, pretty easy to kind of take a grasp of. It is FlyQuest versus Cloud9 in a rematch of what we got earlier on in the week. The winner is the number 1 seed, and the loser is the number 2 seed. It is that simple. They traded 1-1 in the regular season, and both of them have the same record, so they are playing off in a tiebreaker. The second and third tiebreaker a little bit more complicated because it is a 3-way tie for 3rd place right now. It's going to be a matchup between Evil Geniuses and 100 Thieves because the 3rd team in that equation, CLG, Counterlogic Gaming, has the best record against all the other 2 in the head-to-head. They went 2-0 against 100 Thieves in the regular season. They didn't drop a game to them. They went 1-1 against Evil Geniuses, and then EG and 100 Thieves split 1-1 as well. And so 100 Thieves has the worst record, Evil Geniuses is in the middle, and CLG has the best record of all the teams that are sitting at 10-8 against each other. And so it'll be EG taking on 100 Thieves in Game 1. The winner of that will then go on to play CLG for the 3rd place spot. So the worst CLG can do is 4th. The worst 100 Thieves and EG can do is 5th, and then Golden Guardians is locked at 6th. We also have a game for 1st place that we're going to talk about first, but a lot of crazy tiebreaker scenarios. One of the more interesting end-of-the-week scenarios we could have possibly gotten. One of the more improbable ones as well, with EG going 0-3 and Golden Guardians also going 0-3, with both CLG and 100 Thieves going 3-0. Not a lot of people saw this end result coming, but it is definitely interesting. So let's jump right into it, starting off with our first tiebreaker game for 1st place in the LCS. We had FlyQuest taking on Cloud9, and Cloud9 picks up the win here. Absolutely huge from them. This was an incredibly hard-fought match between two very good teams. You can talk about FlyQuest kind of falling off a bit towards the back half of the season, but they looked really good on days 2 and 3. They really showed that they have a lot of fight left in them. And then they come out against a really white-hot Cloud9 team, minus the CLG game. And they give them a great fight. This game was significantly closer than what they had at the beginning of the week. Both teams honestly playing really well. Cloud9's going to be able to make the difference in this one because it's a Draven game, baby. They played Elise Draven, and you gotta shut down the Draven. This is just one of those games where that champion got so ridiculously out of control that there was nothing that you could do in the late game. He was going to shred everyone on your team. As soon as he built LDR, that Scion was getting melted. He was flashing on top of the Xin Zhao. I mean, Draven just became such a big problem, and obviously, big props to Berserker. He played the game phenomenally, but this is what happens when you let Draven get ahead. I'm shocked that they let it through in a game like this. Berserker's Draven has been notoriously fantastic in the LCS since last year. I am surprised to see in such an important game Fly makes such a mistake like that, but they allow it to go through and they're just not able to rebound. They played relatively okay. We'll talk about them in a bit, but let's talk about what Cloud9 did well. Obviously, player of the game is going to go to Berserker. There really is no second thought about this. He was awesome. He got a ton of help in the early game from Blabber, a ton of assistance trying to get that Draven online, as he absolutely should have. Again, that's not any sort of negative towards Berserker. When you're playing Draven, you should get ganked by your jungler like 85 times before 10 minutes, and that's what they did. They really wanted to make sure that he got online, and the Draven started getting those cash outs, and by the time we hit the mid game, he was doing so much damage. It was so difficult for FlyQuest to even have any remote pressure in the game, because basically anywhere that Berserker went, it was immediately in Cloud9's favor. So big credit to Berserker, big credit to Cloud9. He was super influential. I know people are going to bring up the MVP debate when it comes to this game. One thing that I do want to say, and I don't know, how popular this take is going to be, but it's not really a take. It's more so to say this doesn't really count for as good of a game as this is. This isn't a regular season game. The regular season is over. Your MVP conversation should be done and dusted before this game starts. I'm not going to be taking any of these tiebreakers into account. When it comes to the MVP discussion, I'm taking the 18 games that every team played in the regular season into account, and no more and no less. And so, great game from Berserker, but, maybe Berserker looking better than Prince, it's great, but it's not going to influence my MVP discussion, because inevitably, that's where the entire conversation surrounding this performance in this game is going to go. It was awesome from Berserker, and it was awesome from Blabber, but in the end, we just got to remember this is not the regular season anymore, and that's definitely something to keep in mind. But that's not to take away from how well he played. Again, this is a playoff level series coming out from these two teams, and Berserker stepping up and continuing to look great when the pressure is on the most for Cloud9 is just such a good sign for this team's chances in the playoffs. Blabber continues to be phenomenal. Some of those instant repels that he was able to pull off to dodge Ari charms, to dodge thresh hooks, it's just so ridiculously impressive, the reaction time and the mechanics that Blabber is able to show off. The Elise was absolutely massive for them this game. I think if Berserker had a more average game, Blabber would definitely be looked at as the player of the game here. He was so good at setting the tempo early, creating a lot of advantages for Cloud9, and then honestly just being a huge presence in the late game, securing objectives, being able to blow people up still as that Elise. Remember, her damage does not fall off. It really is just her survivability. This was Blabber, this was Berserker, and this was Sven. The Renata was also really, really big for this team. Those were the three players that I think definitely stood out to me. My dud of the game is going to stay on Cloud9, though. It's going to go to Eminus. He did not have a great end of the season. The final week of the year was not the best that he ever played. 2 games of Jace coming in back-to-back, neither of them really looking all that good. That's a pick that I don't expect this team to pull out all that frequently in the playoffs, considering how he played it in the regular season here. Or in the tiebreaker game here, I should say, but, they were able to kind of survive, even though mid lane was very much in favor of FlyQuest. In this game, Berserker was just way too strong. Sven did a great job keeping him alive, enabling him. He was awesome this game. Blabber was awesome this game. Fudge did all the things he needed to do. Cloud9 really proved in this series and in this game why they are considered the #1 team in the league right now, and I don't really think it's all that disputable anymore. As for FlyQuest on the other side, they did put up a fight. This certainly wasn't them rolling over and just dying in this game. There were a couple players in particular that I thought played really well. Vikla played fantastic in the early game, able to generate a really large lead on the Ari over Eminus on the Jace, and Unfortunately, there just wasn't a lot that the Ahri could do in the mid to late game. You gotta land Charm, and it's really hard to land Charm on a very squishy comp or slippery is the word I'm looking for, a very slippery comp like this. On the side of Cloud9, Draven's never gonna be in range of that, and the Elise is just gonna repel away basically instantly. Some really good reaction mechanics coming out from Blabber to stop him getting blown up by Vikla on multiple occasions, but outside of, maybe the endgame team fights where Ahri does kind of struggle, Vikla looked fantastic on this pick, and again, just another example of this player being really good no matter what Reddit tells you. Spica was solid in this game. I thought Ayla was pretty good. I felt pretty bad for Prince. Again, another game where I don't think he played bad really at all. He just didn't really have a lot of opportunities to take over. His mechanics were definitely on display in the mid game where some of those fights, he was dodging skill shots left and right and looking really good there, but Berserker was just better than him in this game. There really is no other way to put it. And then Impact in the top lane was getting shredded instantly by the Draven towards the back half. Overall, there was some good to take away from FlyQuest. They made some really smart micro decisions and macro decisions. Cloud9, forcing a fight down in the bot lane to set up for Dragon. And then FlyQuest goes and sneaks Baron. That is a really good call that a lot of teams just would not make, but FlyQuest pulled the trigger on that. There are some positive signs for FlyQuest in this game, but really the big takeaway for me is how good Cloud9 is as a unit and as a team. I think as a group, they are better than as individuals, and they're already really good individuals. That just shows you how good this Cloud9 team is. They should be the favorites for a lot of people going into the playoffs, and this game proves exactly why. And now moving on to our third place tiebreaker games. Of course, we're going to be kicking it off with the battle for 5th place. Technically, the loser will be getting 5th. The winner will have a chance to move on and try and get 3rd. But this is going to be the end of the regular season for either Evil Geniuses or 100 Thieves. And it is the end for Evil Geniuses. 100T is able to pick up the win here. Not really surprising at all considering the directions that both of these teams were moving in the final week of the season here, but it still is good to see it actually happen. First of all, what a disaster for Evil Geniuses finishing the split in 5th place. Not only just from expectations, because really there is no explainable reason why this team should be down in 5th in terms of the talent level they have, but also just from where they were at the beginning of the week. It felt like a lock for this team to finish 3rd. There really didn't seem like there was going to be a way for someone to cover the distance, unless maybe Golden Guardians had a fantastic week, but to see this team drop down to number 5 with both 100 Thieves and CLG leapfrogging them this week, it just really goes to show how bad of a week they had in general. But let's talk about 100T, because they pick up another win in a row here. That's a 6th win in a row. For 100 Thieves, they really, really looked good, and again, this is the game that encapsulates both of these teams so well, not only in terms of the result, but in terms of how we got there. Evil Geniuses actually did a really good job generating an early lead in this game. FBI and Vulcan in particular were just better than Doublelift and Busio in the laning phase. FBI obliterated Doublelift early on. That Kai'Sa had absolutely zero pressure, and the Varus was getting very strong. So what does 100T do? They slow the game down. They lane swap. They bring the Scion down to the bot lane. They move the Kai'Sa and the Rakan up to top side. They say, screw it, we're going to try to get this Kai'Sa online. We're going to sacrifice our Scion to do so, and they just slow the game down and slow the game down, and they wait for Lissandra to get on, and they wait for Viego to get online, and they wait for Kai'Sa to get online, and they eventually hit this mid game where, honestly, if you're looking at the macro decisions between these two teams, it's night and day. 100T makes some of the better mid-game macro decisions in the league, and Evil Geniuses, quite frankly, just makes the worst macro decisions in the league. And so slowing the game down, getting to that mid to late game, letting 100 Thieves kind of play in their comfort zone, that's exactly what this team needed. They got to the fights where Kai'Sa could really start taking over with a lot of this damage. You had resets coming in on Viego. You had a ridiculous amount of CC with Lissandra, and then the Rakan coming in. There were so many avenues for 100 Thieves to be able to win this game in the back half, and they played to their win condition excellently, expertly in this game. Player of the game is going to go to Busio for me in the support position for 100 Thieves. You cannot give him his Rakan anymore. We have hit the point for 100 Thieves where that is a must ban, a perma-ban against this team from here on out. I don't expect this team to get it all that often in the playoffs. If it is left up, I imagine this team is going to jump on it because Busio on Rakan has been an absolute menace over the last few weeks. He has arguably been the best support in the region over the last 2 weeks of the season, playing almost exclusively Rakan. Obviously, some games of Renata here and there, but the Rakan has been so big for this team, and I don't expect that priority to go down anytime soon. Clearly, him being on these flank angles, him being given some agency to be able to engage alongside of his more aggressive jungler and his more aggressive mid laner in these team fights, that's a really good thing for this team overall. It allows Tenacity to play a little bit more of a peel kind of role. Even Bjergsen gets to play a little bit more of a peel kind of role, and Busio can just kind of fling himself headlong into the enemy team, and it's really worked out. Busio has been awesome over the second half of the split, really starting to live up to a lot of the promise that people had for him going into the year. Doublelift was also really good this week. This game wasn't great in the early game. He got kind of trounced by FBI. Not the first time that we've said that in Doublelift's career, but it's good to see that he had the wherewithal to be able to kind of calm the game down, slow it down a bit, get to the power spike that Kaisa can hit, and then actually be able to do really well in the late game. Closer, very similar. Viego's one of those champions that can sometimes lose a little bit of pressure early, but you're going to be able to be really strong in the mid-game skirmishes. And then as soon as that snowball starts rolling, it's going to get out of control very quickly. Sion, Lissandra, so many tools to be able to assist a lot of these champions in being able to take over the game. Overall, it's basically everything you could have asked for coming out of 100T. But for Evil Geniuses on the other side, disaster, 5th place. It's just, I mean, how can you justify this? There really is no way. 0-4 in the final week of the season is as bad as it gets. It's not just about as bad. It is as bad as it gets. This team really did not play well towards the back half of the year, and it raises a ton of question marks for their ability to play when the lights are on the brightest in the playoffs here. My dud of the game, again, is going to go to Jojo Pune. He has really not been good for this team at multiple points throughout this season. I'm really concerned about him and how exploitable he might be in a best of 5. Now, Jojo's also had some really good weeks and some really good games. Most of it has been him just being mechanically better than his opponents, though. And going into a player like Bjergsen or maybe another player in the playoffs, right? Like, you're just not going to get that level of separation that you maybe got against some of the bottom teams in the league. I like Jojo as a player, but the macro decisions, the late game, proficiency, getting caught out in River for no reason, those are problems right now. Not only for him, but for this team as a whole, and I really don't see a lot of chances for this team to fix that and really create a solution. Big credit to FBI. I thought he played really well this game. Unfortunately, the rest of the team kind of let him down. Vulcan had some moments where he looked good on Thresh, but Inspired, Someday, not really adding a lot to the cause. And like I said, Evil Genius's team macro is just bad. It's just really bad. Easily the worst of any of the playoff teams, Golden Guardians included. So major question marks surrounding Evil Geniuses. They've been carried by their talent and by their mechanical skill basically all year long up until this point. I feel like that magic fairy dust is starting to wear off, though, and they're going to get a little bit more exposed once we get into the playoffs. But 100 Thieves' day is not over yet. They have to go and win a second tiebreaker now in order to get that number 3 seed. That is going to be a very interesting proposition if they end up winning that. But overall, it's already been a ridiculously successful end of the year for 100 Thieves. It's just about whether or not they're going to be able to cap it off in this next game. And then moving on to our final tiebreaker game to decide 3rd place. Both of these teams already confirming themselves in the upper bracket, of course, with how the LCS playoffs work. Top 4 teams in upper bracket, bottom 2 teams in lower bracket. It just really is deciding who's going to be facing FlyQuest and who's going to be facing Cloud9. And the winner of that game between CLG and 100 Thieves to decide the number 3 seed was 100 Thieves. They are able to take the game, go 7-0 to end out the year, and take 3rd place. This felt unachievable for this team going into the final week of the season, but here we are. We had 2 teams who really stepped it up in the last week, duking it out, and one of them came out on top, that one being 100 Thieves. The heist is complete. They have stolen 3rd place back, and they looked so freaking good doing it. I feel really bad for CLG, because not only did they beat 100 Thieves both times in the regular season, but they still have the season series against them. They were better than 100 Thieves in the regular season, but they end up losing the tiebreaker, and so they end up with a lower position. I do think that's a little bit of a weird format. I feel like CLG should have been the 3rd seed, but doesn't really matter here. 100 Thieves definitely proving that they are, at the very least, one of the best teams in the entire region, and they really just know how to play the game. This time, not so much a problem in the early game. We were talking about Evil Geniuses, maybe at least shoving 100 Thieves down in their weaker part of the game, which is early. CLG didn't even have that going for them. This was just 100 Thieves all the way. Really, really fun game coming out from this team. It took them a little bit longer than maybe I would have expected for them to be able to end it, but at the end of the day, at least they were able to win the game. That's the part that matters. Player of the game, no-brainer. It's gonna go to Doublelift. He has been so unbelievably good over the course of the year in the way that, he's been really good. Maybe not, the best player in the league, but really good after being out of the league for 2 years, not even playing professionally, streaming full-time, not even playing the game really all that much, comes right back into the league and immediately reinserts himself as one of the best AD carries in North America. It's just ridiculously impressive what he's been able to accomplish this year. Even me, someone who was, relatively speaking, doubting what Doublelift was going to be able to accomplish this year, I have to just hold my hands up and say, nope, not anymore. I can't doubt him any longer. He was just simply too good this year. He was probably the best player on 100 Thieves, at least the most consistent. He was great at the beginning of the year. He was really good at the end of the year. The middle was a little bit up and down, but he was probably still the best part of this team when they were going through their massive losing streak. He's just been so much more impressive than I could have ever expected for this team, and he is a massive reason why they are heading into playoffs as the number 3 seed. Big credit to Doublelift, big credit to Busio, who just continues to look awesome in that support role. Again, just talked about him last game, but him and DL have developed a really nice chemistry together. They are really good in the 2v2, but Busio's chemistry in these team fights is really what separates him from a lot of the other supports in the region that might just be pretty good early on, but maybe aren't as impactful towards the second half of the game. Bjergsen goes deathless in this one. He's been ridiculously consistent over this win streak so far. Closer has really stepped it up. He's back to being super aggressive, making these crazy plays. He's got teammates that are willing to back him up now. Tenacity's gotten a lot better on the weak side. Really, there aren't a lot of weaknesses left for this 100 Thieves team to actually overcome. This was a massive win for them, and you've got to be excited for this team. As for CLG on the other side, it's unfortunate. Obviously, I would be really pissed off if I went 2-0 against a team in the regular season and then had to play a tiebreaker against them to get my spot in the playoff bracket, but it is what it is. If you wanted to be the 3rd seed, I guess you should have just won this game, but CLG not able to do that. They lasted it a little bit longer than maybe they had any right to. This gold was actually relatively even for a while, mostly because they were farming pretty well, but I mean, tempo-wise and just map pressure-wise, they were really never in this game. My dud of the game is pretty easily going to go to Dokla in the top lane. You're relying a lot on Yone in this comp to be able to actually deal damage in team fights. Talia's not really going to do it. Gragas really isn't going to do it. Varus can do it, but you don't want to rely on him as your only primary carry. You really need Dokla on this Yone to step up and be like an actively positive piece for CLG. And unfortunately, he just had a really bad game. He really didn't do all that much. The damage was not coming out. The ultimates were not hitting. It was unfortunate. Dokla likes to go for these melee-oriented carries in the top lane. CLG does like to play around him. Unfortunately, in this pivotal game, it just didn't work out in the way that I think they wanted it to. I'm not going to overreact here. Players like Contracts and Poom definitely had bad games. There's a narrative that maybe Contracts taken off of some of these tanks, like Sejuani and Vi, he isn't going to be nearly as effective on a pick like Gragas, where he actually has to go out and make plays. I don't necessarily subscribe to that. I still am a little bit worried about CLG in terms of the grand picture of everything, but this team is who we think they are. I'm not trying to overrate or underrate what they are capable of. They are an incredibly solid unit that plays together. They may be a little bit overmatched when playing some of the more talented teams in the league, but generally speaking, they are still going to put up a fight against pretty much anybody. Even though they weren't able to take this, they are not a team that can be overlooked come playoff time. They're going to have a pretty hard challenge in round 1, but, if any team can believe in the faith and overcome expectations, it's probably going to be this NA Savior CLG team. And then for 100 Thieves, they've set up a very intriguing matchup in round 1 that I'm excited to preview. But for now, all I'm going to say is congratulations to 100 Thieves on being able to bounce back incredibly well from a losing streak and really show that you are one of the best teams in North America. All right, that is going to do it for my LCS Week 8 overview and analysis of all 3 days of action, all 18 games one of the longest videos that we have done all year long. These are more games than we cover in the LPL. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you stuck around to the end. If you did, I really do appreciate you. Up on the screen right now, you're going to see the final LCS standings and some question marks on the screen. Usually, I would talk about my power rankings here, but I'm actually going to be saving those because I will be doing my playoff primer series just like I did last year. I'll be going over all 6 playoff teams, the strengths and the weaknesses, previewing the matchups, previewing expectations, and giving a mock bracket, if you will, for what I expect to happen come playoff time. If you are excited for that, hit the subscribe button so you can get an idea of when that video goes live in a couple of days. It's going to be a little bit later next week. I'm going to be prepping for that most of the weekend. Of course, we're going to have videos coming out all weekend long as well for all the other regions, so get excited for that. It's time to talk about Player of the Week and Dud of the Week, though. My Player of the Week in Week 8, this was a little bit of a tough choice, but it's actually going to be a second-time winner this split. It's going to go to Palafox on CLG. I thought he was super good for Counter Logic Gaming. The team was really, really fun to watch over the week. Of course, a lot of people are going to give it to somebody on 100 Thieves, and I totally understand that, but for me, Palafox was just so good over the course of the week. If you want to give it to Double Lift, if you want to give it to Closer, Closer was probably the one I would have given it to on the side of 100 Thieves. I totally understand. They both had really, really phenomenal weeks, but Palafox is going to be getting my Player of the Week for CLG. And then my Dud of the Week, it's going to go to River on the side of Golden Guardians. I think very realistically, you could have given this to someone like Jojo Pune as well, but for me, River underperformed, I think, the most in comparison to maybe what expectations were, and just generally was a big contributing factor as to why Golden Guardians went 0-3 in the final week of the season and ended up just barely scraping into the 6th spot in the playoffs. So River is going to get my Week 8 Dud of the Week, and Palafox is going to get my Week 8 Player of the Week, but that's going to do it. I really do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, let me know down in the comments section below. What do you guys think is going to happen in the playoffs? I'm excited to hear you guys' thoughts and feedback. Also, of course, in that video, I'll be going over my award selections, my MVP, Rookie of the Split, All-Pro, all that stuff will be listed in that video. Excited to go over that. Of course, if you enjoyed this video, hit the like button. It really does mean a lot for the channel. It helps get this video out to a lot more people, and also it just lets me know that you guys are enjoying it. And like I said earlier, hit subscribe if you are new. We don't only cover the LCS here, we cover all 4 of the major regions, as well as the NACL on this channel, and it's playoff time basically everywhere around the world right now. So if you want playoff coverage, this is the place for it. But, of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all later.